Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pixel Vision podcast. I'm Deft Beck,
I'm Gamer Rez.
and today's topic is Nostalgia Attack, in which we talk about how different game companies approach nostalgia. So, like in past episodes, we start with the past, we go to the present, and then we go to the future of our given topic. So first, it's a little weird to say the past of nostalgia, but here's how I'm going to frame it. So, we're going to talk about when the games that are the subject of nostalgia appeals by these game companies were made, the milieu of the 80s and the 90s in which these games were actually made. So, back then, mobile phones did not have video games on them, besides maybe Snake. So, what we had is arcade and console games. You would go to a physical location to go check out the new games, you would pay your quarters, you would pay $5 in quarters to beat Knights of the Round. You would go home and you would play the arcade version of your console game.
Actually, I mean, you want to be technically speaking, quarters, yeah, if it was the 80s.
True.
By the 90s, you were already putting dollars in. Inflation, baby.
Yeah, and then by the early 2000s, we had our little magnetic swipe cards.
Yeah. Well, except for my arcade, because my area, was still 10 years behind all the time when I lived in Pennsylvania.
Right. Yeah, I have to remember every region kind of remember the whole Napoleon Dynamite thing where it depicts a little pocket of society, it's a little behind?
Yeah, I do. Honestly, my hometown feels a lot like that. We got a Sheets years later in 2008 when everybody already had it, and it was like, oh my god, this thing has a touchscreen? That was when after the DS has been out for a few years and the iPhone was just announced. It's like, oh, we're in the future now. People had this for several years already. That shows you where I came from.
Yeah, what usually happens is the big cities like New York and Chicago, that's where when all the new technology and all the new games are being debuted. The NES, when that was first demoed, that was in they did a test market in the middle of New York City. That's when the NES.
How many times you say
okay.
Just saying.
Brand new technology to the West was debuted in cities like New York City, so it took a while for that sort of thing to go over to the Midwest and to the South and stuff. So, to a certain degree, maybe you'd be playing Donkey Kong in the middle of your bar in the Midwest in the mid-'80s, but then you finally get, a couple of years later, you get, Mappy or some other kind of Namco game. So I'd imagine because of the fact that you were restricted to whatever was physically at your location, it was harder to go and discover new games unless you're reading magazines and quarterlies and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the internet itself was still very much, in the early 90s was dial-up days, so you can only look up so much information. There wasn't still a lot of it out there outside of, chat forums and things like that, and maybe IRC clients. But in terms of actual mass promotioning for video games, it was very similar to any other form of media back then. TV spots were a big deal because television was still the main pretty much premier form of everybody was getting their media from at the time.
There weren't a lot of channels.
Though there were thousands of channels. We had satellites since the late 80s. It's just, there was nothing to watch. Ever. Unless you want to use pay-per-view and then watch all the movies, you can go rent at Blockbuster for $3.
It's true.
Anyway.
Game rentals, too. That's a good topic, too.
Game rentals, yeah. But again, that doesn't really focus on the nostalgia thing too much. It was more so...
People are nostalgic for rentals, arguably.
Yeah, but good luck getting that market to come back now.
Yeah, definitely.
That's never happening. Especially in Japan.
Mm-hmm. Well, Japan, they outlawed.
I know. There's still some mom and pops, and the last Blockbuster in the world, loves the fact they exist.
It's a very ironic sort of thing.
It is. We're the only Blockbuster, and that ironically gets them business, because it's interesting to people. I don't know what they're going to do when people that, don't care anymore after a certain amount of years, but they think it's great right now for nostalgia reasons, which is exactly what we're discussing. I think another important thing to talk about, though, in terms of the past, is while right now nostalgia in the present is obviously being a dead horse that has been beaten like crazy to the point where it is dust that once resembled a dead horse.
It's a dust-shaped horse.
Basically, or dust that was in the shape of a horse. It was always kind of companies were recycling their ideas. I mean, you had the NES and stuff, but then the NES had arcade titles coming to it. And before that, Atari had a port of Pac-Man that was awful.
Very infamous, yes.
Yeah, but even if you move up just a few generations, like even to the 16-bit and the 32-bit era, which we're only talking like a 10-year difference here. Not a lot of time has passed. You've got arcade compilations and stuff coming out that people are buying. And then if you move even a little bit further up into the early 2000s, you have all of the plug-and-play consoles that resemble tiny little console or tiny little arcade machines like Pac-Man. Stuff from Atari was the biggest stuff, as well as a ton of proprietary garbage for like cartoons like Scooby-Doo and, I don't know, Shrek for some reason.
Yeah.
And then also I remember too, in terms of nostalgia baiting, a lot of classic games before the smartphone boom. You could almost even say this was a precursor to the smartphone boom. All the Mega Touch setups. You were starting to see in the bars everywhere. Bars, a few restaurants too, were basically all replacing a lot of original arcade units because they were lighter, they were smaller, and they were basically emulation devices. A lot of them which would touch
$100, and then it'd be like you could put them up there for years and years and years.
Yeah, and they were popular for quite a little while actually, and I would say what actually killed them probably was smartphones.
Definitely.
Which we'll get to with the present. But my point is, nostalgia doesn't really have a time period where it begins or where it even entirely ends, actually. It seems to start as soon as a company can capitalize on investment from a consumer standpoint. The moment it kind of starts to fade out of existence, like, hey, remember Pac-Man? Here's the Mega Touch thing with Pac-Man on it, because I think it did have like joysticks and stuff too. But then at the same time, 20 years later, hey, remember Pac-Man anyway? Now it's in Smash Brothers. It's like, it doesn't seem to really have a time period for it.
Well, the important thing to remember is the media mix. So this is a marketing term meaning TV, magazines, posters, arcade flyers. That was the traditional sort of media mix for arcade games and console games when the games were being created. As of a couple of decades ago, like in the 90s and the 2000s, that, you know, there were still TV ads, there were still magazines, you saw the emergence of the internet. Now it's almost entirely internet-based. There's some television stuff, but mainly for the big AAA games, barely any niche stuff. So, what I would conclude for the past, unless you have anything else you wanted to say for that?
The one other thing I wanted to say about the past, essentially, is I feel when re-releases were starting to happen from more major popular properties, I'm talking games that were like absolute best sellers, like console sellers for past generations, the Mario titles, the Sonic titles. I think a lot of more attention to detail and passion was put into them. The Mario All-Stars and World cartridge, while it seems like nothing to us now because we only have a million different ways to play Mario Brothers 1 through 3 and World, well, especially 1 through 3, World not as much, but back then was a big deal because they included Mario Brothers 2 with the lost levels, they cleaned up the graphics, eventually they even threw World on there right before the end of the SNES's lifespan, basically. And then included with a nice little menu and everything. That was a big deal. That was not a common thing then. And then Sega started doing stuff like that too with, I believe the Saturn had like recompilations of like Sonic, didn't it?
Sonic
basically?
Jam. And they also had the cartridge that included, I remember around the Sega CD 32X era, they were trying to go and recycle some of their older Genesis games. So they had like a 4-in-1, 5-in-1 cart with a lot of the older Genesis launch titles on it.
Yeah. And the hardware was similar enough that the emulation itself wasn't bad. I wouldn't argue it. I wouldn't say it's as good as anything in terms of the accuracy we get today with anything like either really good software emulation or even FPGA emulation, which is hardware emulation, which is another topic for later on in this. But overall, I do feel there was more of an attention on quality with things like this. And as we move forward into the plug-and-play days, because there were plug-and-play days for especially things like Sega. Sega did have their own like Genesis plug-and-play stuff, the at-game stuff. HDMI, composite, very much behind on the times. Even when HD TVs were starting to become the norm, this was very seriously shoddy technology that fails in comparison to the detail I think was put into the previous offerings.
System on
and was done to make a buck.
Yeah, the system on a chip emulation.
Yeah, they're like worse than the clone consoles, basically. Like all the terrible ones that don't play Mario Brothers with the right color palette and the sound is all off and it's very laggy and they break super easy and won't even play all the games. like lockout chips can beat them easily if a game has it.
Right. Well, you also saw in the past, I'm speaking not necessarily the period in which the games were made, but by the 90s, by the late 90s, in the early 2000s, you saw the first compilations being released, like the Namco Museum Collection, which is the 6-game collection of all their classic arcade titles. So they were boutique sort of releases in which not only could you play these games, but you could wander around like in a virtual museum. You could learn about the games and how they were made and see arcade flyers. It was all digitized and it was all very nice. I do remember in the US, the Namco Museum Volume 1, the one with the N on it, did go and see, it got into the greatest hits compilation. So there was a definite audience for it. What you also saw was, as the 2000s and the PS2 approached, you saw compilations from, Namco made the 20th or 30th anniversary collection. Activision made the Intellivision Classics and the Intellivision Lives compilations. So this sort of thing has always been around, but I think the packaging and the way that they were marketed is definitely different then than it is now.
I definitely agree.
Emulation
with
has gotten better. The mix of the games is different. I think people have much more of an appreciation for it now, but the companies know this, and
some of them know this.
So what we watched some videos by the gaming historian person Frank Cifaldi. He put it in terms of the categories of the casual consumer, the enthusiast consumer, and the hardcore art file sort of super hardcore consumer.
Right.
So a lot of these compilations more or less appealed to the first two groups, and it's hard to get the third group to go be interested in those emulations because they might not be interested in it on the value of fidelity, as well as they might want to go and play on the original cabinets, if anything else.
Yeah, which would be the type of person I myself personally would fall in lines with, even though I've used emulation for years. It was the only way I was able to experience some Japanese games. My favorite, one of my favorite Mega Man games is Mega Man Bass or Rockman and Forte. Was originally only released on the Super Famicom, and the only way I could play it years ago was through emulation. There was no way of me really getting it outside of like an eBay purchase, which I never even would have known it existed because that was when the internet was still, not crawling with video game stuff absolutely everywhere. It was mostly just fan pages and stuff.
An important distinction must be made between what we as the enthusiasts do to go and experience these games that are no longer for sale versus that which the corporations go and try to appeal to people who may not always do that.
Yes. So what I want to start with first, as we move into the present, is there's a very big misconception between a particular word as well as a term, and that word is retro. You might see a lot of groups these days, YouTube channels, what have you, various communities describe themselves as retro. I'm a retro game collector. Oh, you guys got retro games? The truth of the matter is people don't understand what the word retro actually means. Retro, by definition, the first definition is an adjective describing imitative of a style, fashion, or design from the recent past. Translating that into video games means it is a product that is being developed to imitate something from the past. A retro game is pretty much all these indie games coming out that have that pixelated style or try to imitate something from the past. Good examples of stuff like this is Shovel Knight, the continuation of the Monster World series. Even something Undertale is even arguably imitating Earthbound, which is retro in that sense. But Earthbound itself is not retro. Mario is not retro.
Arguably, Earthbound is a parody of Dragon Quest.
Fair, but my point is, though, in terms of what retro means, old games, anything old in general is not retro if that was its original style. There's really no word for it, but the best term I can honestly use is old school. So if you're playing a Game Boy with Mario or the original Pokemon on it, instead of playing Mario Odyssey or Pokemon Sword and Shield coming out or whatever, that's old school. That is the best way I could possibly put it. I don't just call it old, but it's not retro. And you don't want to confuse these terms, because if you do, then when something comes out that's a compilation of games from a company like Capcom's Mega Man collections or Sega's Genesis collections, those aren't retro games. They're old school games. They're from generations past. A retro game imitates old school games, and sometimes even imitates something that originally came from, like Sonic Mania. Sonic Mania is retro. It is a new game that very much is imitating something from 20 years ago. 20-some years ago.
Another distinction must be made between remakes and remasters.
Yeah. Remake itself is essentially, if it's remade with newer graphics and newer assets, it's a bit of a difficult thing to explain, but it's definitely not old school. But if it's retro or not is kind of up to you, depending on what aspects make it retro. Like if the control, like Yooka-Laylee, for example, isn't a remake, but it's in the same style as Banjo-Kazooie. One could argue it's kind of retro, but really it's still just a 3D platformer. So I would just call it a new game, really.
Well, let's make another example. Resident Evil 2 for the PlayStation 4 and the modern consoles is a remake of Resident Evil 2 for the PlayStation 1 and all those generations of consoles.
Again, though, going like the Yooka-Laylee thing too, though, even though it's a remake, it has the spirit of Resident Evil 2 perfectly. In terms of its setting, it recreates the police station, everything. If you're not familiar with Resident Evil 2 setting, basically, the majority of it takes place in a police station and then an underground laboratory, which is where Umbrella's from, that make all the zombies happen. Very layman's terms explanation. But basically, the remake itself doesn't play at all like the old game. The tank controls are gone. It's more like a modern third-person shooter, which is good because it's embracing the improvements of the present without losing the charm and the appeal of the past. Take note, other companies. Square.
Yeah,
Konami.
We're gonna go and name each of these companies and then discuss whether or not these companies, when they go and revive an old IP, whether or not they're just making the same game again with a fresh coat of paint, whether or not they're just re-releasing the same game in like a retro collection for $20, and when they make a new game that's a new game in the series, whether or not it's imbuing the same sort of spirit and then advancing the property based on the iterations that are being made.
Right. So let's start with just first off the offerings of actually playing old school games with the mini consoles.
Or the retro console boxes, as well as the arcade stand-up things that we're seeing in Walmart and GameStop and things like that.
They're not retro, though. Well, essentially, you could call their design retro, but the actual games themselves are old school. Okay. We gotta make this distinction because there's new games coming out.
Yeah, with old things in them.
Yes. Like... These are things... Let's start with just the mini consoles. Let's not do the arcade stand-ups yet. Starting with the mini consoles. Before that, we had the Raspberry Pi.
Well...
And things
Raspberry
like that.
Pi was in the early 2010s. I had one in college.
Well, I didn't have one. But what I'm saying is... Okay, so technically speaking, it starts with... We had emulation on just PCs in general. NES emulation was possible, like, right around, what, the mid to late 90s?
Yes.
It started with Nesticle and everything?
Yes.
That was the first... not commercially available, it was very much open source, but that was the first NES emulator, I believe, known to be available to the public to download online and play NES games on Windows 98 and Windows 2000.
From what I remember, some of the first plug-in boxes you could buy were the Atari Flashback series, at least the
Correct.
first popular ones.
Yeah, I actually bought my mom one for Christmas. It actually doesn't run too bad for just some emulation box on Composite. And back then, even though I could still play them on PCs, it was still... more difficult to get a bunch of computers to just say, hey, Ma, here's an emulation box to play those games from the 80s. Back then, it was still difficult to get computers. Now I have a graveyard of computers. Like, you haven't been to my house yet. I'm as bad as Sigma in some cases.
Sigma is our friend for anyone who's in our circle.
Yeah, just inside thing. He just basically has a ton of equipment, computers, arcade stuff.
Suffice to say.
A lot of stuff there. But my point is... It was harder. Computers were still more of a novelty thing. My mom had a gateway laptop. An
enthusiast thing.
Yeah, well, they were not even just enthusiasts. They were a novelty too, especially because you had to have a lot of money.
Well, think of who had a computer in the 90s.
My mother, because she worked for a lawyer and needed it.
Yes, but that was also Windows 95 in particular. That era of computers was the debut of the idea of the home having a computer. The Macintosh, when they were competing with Windows 95 and having people go and say, oh, I have my home computer that I use to go and type up things, to do homework, to do my taxes, to browse the web.
I would argue PCs came out earlier than that.
But the Macintosh was popularized the idea of the home computer.
Maybe. I honestly...
There's a pretty good video I could show you that's pretty funny of this marketing video for the Macintosh in the mid-90s where it's a family that's debating whether or not to get a home computer, and they have to come up with reasons to that. Their dad is like, we don't need a computer in the house, it's just going to be for playing games, and they have to like make a case to go and get a home computer because it's useful for every single member of the family.
I mean, okay, that makes sense. But what I'm trying to state, though, is that we had basically 2 computers that actually were functional PCs in the entire house. My mother's gateway laptop for work, which I screwed around and went on AOL a lot and stuff. And then I actually had a Dell desktop for myself. But the point is, I couldn't just grab a random PC from whatever and just throw a bunch of others and say, here you go, Ma, here's emulation for all the stuff that you like to play. No, I couldn't do that. So that was when like all the plug-and-play consoles came out, and I got her an Atari Flashback for Christmas, and she loved it and played it a few times, and I don't know, she plays it now and then. I played it a few times. But the point is, it was a good product for what it was then. Now a lot of those things are basically gone because, one, computers are stupidly easy to get now to just play old school games on. You can go to a flea market and get a laptop for $20. Even the newer ones, because old school games are so small, you can load them all up.
Or just stream them from the internet, which is another topic we'll get into.
Yeah, you can even do that early in the mid-2000s. I remember at school we were playing Game Boy games on the computer lab without ever having to put it on the actual computer. Although I was a boss, I had a flash drive and Project 64, so what's up.
Boot into Linux, it's like, what password?
I have literally run virtual machines on my school computers before. They know what the fuck I was doing. It was funny.
Yeah.
But the point is that accessibility was not around then. And as you move forward, people didn't want to play games on their PC still as much. At least a lot of people remember it. So you have things like RetroPies, that was more definitely enthusiast period. Because a lot of people still don't have RetroPies, believe it or not.
I've seen RetroPie setups you can buy on Amazon for under $100 that come with the controllers that very strongly resemble the Super NES controllers.
Sure, but have you seen them at Best Buy? Have you seen them at Walmart? No, that's what I'm getting at. So, the plug-and-play consoles, gone. RetroPie was still more of an enthusiast thing.
CVS and stuff, and Target and stuff.
They're there, but they don't bring in the numbers they did then, trust me.
Right, and we also have to mention the Sega Genesis AtGames plug-and-plays.
Yeah.
Which, for those who don't know the company AtGames, they're a Brazilian company that produces things like the NES Classic and like the product you just mentioned, the Atari Flashback. Because this is sort of a side topic, but Brazil is a market that loves retro games and loves those plug-and-play things because they can't easily get modern consoles due to how their import laws work. So that is how that country got into retro games and developing new-style retro games.
Yes, and that's the correct use of retro there.
Yes.
The reason why I'm talking about emulating on PCs, though, and all these plug-and-play consoles is quite frankly because of accessibility and price and quality, which the majority of these things are cheap. A lot of them are mono.
$60, right?
What's that?
The SNES Classic is $80.
I'm not getting to that yet.
Okay.
I want to make this distinction.
How would you distinguish between plug-and-play and the classic models?
I'm doing that right now.
Okay.
So the plug-and-play consoles, the Atari Flashback, some of them you want to talk in terms of the cheap quality. The plastic is cheap. They break a lot. A lot of them run on batteries. They're composite. Some of them only are mono, too. A Miss Pac-Man I remember getting for my mom as well. I bought her a lot of these things. I'm guilty.
Spoil her. You're a good son.
I'm an only child then, so yeah. But they were mono. All you had was the white cable. There was no stereo sound. They were cute for what they were, but if you were to compare it to the arcade or even PC emulation, you're like, oh my god, this looks terrible. The colors were off on a lot of them. And then things like the AtGames and stuff, too, also are of lower quality. And I think the issue with this is the fact this was aimed very much at a casual market. I don't think these things were meant to ever appeal to the enthusiast, which is why I bought them for my mom. My mom doesn't have time. She was an arcade junkie, but she focused on other aspects of her life. I'm 29 years old and still obsessed with video games, so, you can see where that went. I own an arcade machine back at my mom's house right now. So what does that tell you? But these were aimed purely at casuals. There was really no other target market, basically.
You would argue the NES and the SNES Classic are not casuals?
They are, but the beauty of them is they're a multi-demographic product, and that's what I'm going to get to now. So we fast forward to, 2015? Okay, so the Raspberry Pi was a thing that enthusiasts were already doing for a while. Probably since about 2010.
Yes.
So Raspberry Pi, real quick, is basically the smallest form factor computer on a chip that allows you to run a system on a chip, yeah. Just imagine basically the size of a Game Boy Advance, pretty much. Possibly smaller, depending on what one you get, the fans, etc., etc. It's a lot better than lugging a laptop or a desktop. Even a netbook is bigger than a Raspberry Pi. So you can load this thing up with an SD card, fill it with tons of old school games and a bunch of emulators, and take it everywhere. And that's something a lot of enthusiasts like to do. I would say this is the level a lot of people went to where they want to have a somewhat more authentic experience, where they had like separation of concerns before going to the point of crazy upscalers and stuff to play all their old school games in 1080p like I'm currently doing, which will be a different episode. That is the hardcore, which is very hard to reach in terms of demographic. But these Raspberry Pi devices, while flawed still, because they are relying on open source, so it's all community-based, there's almost no companies producing anything for it, was in untapped markets because of the fact it isn't anything sold fully available to the public. You can buy them on Amazon and stuff, but you're not going to see them at Walmart or Best Buy because, quite frankly, the average consumer doesn't have time to set it up. It requires some computer knowledge. You do have to work in the shell a bit, use ISOs, download things. Basically, if the person doing it doesn't understand something with computers beyond browsing the web in Microsoft Word, they're not going to have time for it, or they're just not going to care.
It reminds me of the market for Kodi devices, which are the devices that allow... Well, you have streaming boxes that you can buy at Amazon, at Walmart, at Best Buy that allow you to go and stream from anything. You can find a Roku channel for every popular movie ever, but it's a distinguishing thing from what you can find on eBay, which is the example I'll use, where you could buy fully loaded Kodi streaming boxes that allow you to pirate movies and see anything you want from any country ever. On a similar basis, you can buy fully loaded RetroPie installations with the fake controllers, and it looks like an NES.
Right. And now enter, as we have this untapped market around, I think it was 2015, enter the mini consoles. And ironically, but probably not too surprising, who was it again that established this industry? Nintendo.
Nintendo has always been very good at reaping the nostalgia for the consoles.
Not even just reaping nostalgia, though. We'll get to that as I explain the benefits in terms of how Nintendo's approach to nostalgia is definitely the best, and you are in agreement with that. But more so, Nintendo first brought video games back basically from the dead after the game crashed, with the West anyway. The East was still doing fine. I'm just going to say the West in general.
It must be said America, for the most part, because the game crash didn't really affect the UK or the arcade scene that much.
Oh, it really didn't affect the... I thought it affected the UK,
It did not, because
really?
The UK had the home computer scene with the BBC Micro and the Acorn.
You got a good point there. I see what you're saying.
For those who don't know, the BBC Micro was among a group of these small computers that were given out to schools to help kids learn programming, and then people were able to go and make their own games and sell them. And that's why the UK has such a robust programming community today.
So in regards to that then, would you argue that the UK was already more focused on PC gaming, that Nintendo might have actually had a better hand in not revitalizing gaming in the UK, but actually starting the console scene?
There were consoles in the UK, but they were never necessarily as popular as the set-top boxes that people plugged the Commodore 64 into their television. It was a computer, but you could play console-style games on the Commodore.
Yeah, they're lucky they had
and the ZX and the ZX Spectrum also. The ZX Spectrum, if you don't want to say ZX. But what I would say in terms of that is the UK, for a while until the markets merged in the 2000s and the 2010s, I would argue they were much more focused on the idea of the computer in the home.
Right.
This sort of thing was also evident in terms of the Famicom. The Famicom, a lot of people don't remember, that's the NES in the original name. The Japanese name is the Famicom for the NES. The family computer.
Yeah, Famicom's really just a slang term.
Yes, so there were a lot of utilities sold for the family computer. There were keyboards, there were banking utilities, there were word processors you could do for it. And in terms of the UK, meanwhile, you had to go and do lots of it wasn't a plug-and-play experience in the UK. A lot of times you couldn't necessarily buy a cartridge for a game. Instead, you had floppy disks, you had tape drives, you had all sorts of add-ons you needed. You needed to add RAM, you needed to go and configure your computers a certain way in order to get games to work. It was much more of... The homebrew scene was much more tightly integrated into what was known as the consumer scene in the UK.
Well, regardless of, even though Nintendo saved the game industry in the US then, I won't say the West, I will say the US then particularly, I will state, regardless of that fact, it seems they also pioneered the beginning of the mini console craze that's just started the past few years. And I think this is part and due to the fact of how Nintendo handles their method of nostalgia and how they utilize it to build their brand. Whereas most other companies seem to be using nostalgia to make a quick buck and don't understand the actual nuances and implications that make people that are invested in these games, in these series, these memories, feel about them. They don't understand that initial process of enjoying something you played years ago as a kid, not because it's the thing you enjoy. There's a lot of things you can go back to as a kid and be like, oh God, why did I mean, some people, okay, can hang on to anything, but it's pretty hard to go back to watching, I don't know, all seasons of Barney again when you're, 30 years older. It's just some things I really don't think you can go back to.
Episode 3 is the best, man. I love the teeth brushing song. Oh, that one really bops, man.
My mother used to tell me that she had nightmares because when I was a kid I watched Barney so much, and she would have nightmares of all the characters going to her and forcing her to play with them, and she just wanted to go to sleep.
That's awful.
I kind of almost want to film a horror movie or something like that.
And one more note on the retro boxes. A lot of these boxes came out because Nintendo more than likely had some market research that suggested, years before these retro boxes came about, I would see in mall kiosks these 1001 NES system on a chip boxes.
Yes, that was
also... It was meant to fight that. It was meant for Nintendo to okay, this is the official product. You don't need to buy these rip-off boxes that have all of our games in it. This is an official polished product. Right,
but you know what, though? That could have worked, and that's all they could have done. They could have just went, here's the official Nintendo plug-and-play console with composite input and just, a system on a chip and ROMs that we stole off the internet ourselves that we made. Wii Virtual Consoles, stolen Mario Brothers. But that's not what they did. They actually gave you a package that felt like you were buying a mini NES, package and all. The promotional artwork, the package itself, the design of the box. The actual NES Classic itself it's just a Raspberry Pi. That's all it is, without Wi-Fi even. It doesn't matter, though. It wasn't the hardware itself. It wasn't what was inside it. It was the detail they put on it. It's in the same sense of if you bought, a hot rod car. If I sold you, an old Mustang or something, and it was beat up to hell and everything from, 1975 and had sons of... What do you want it? I mean, it's just... The internals are great, but the body is falling apart. Or it doesn't even have a body. It's just an ugly-ass just shell, basically, which is a Raspberry Pi. Or do you want the one with the pristine body that was taken care of for decades, and you could tell the owner put a lot of love into it, kept the environment from getting to it so it doesn't rust or anything. It looks like it was just brand new right off the lot from 50 years ago. I guarantee that's going to sell way faster, outside of someone wanting to fix it up anyway. That was Nintendo's approach.
Yes.
And on top of that, instead of just going with the system on a chips, they looked into the Raspberry Pi concept and realized that software emulation was better than going with the system on a chips, which was very, very poor hardware emulation, and developed their own actual emulator for the NES. While there is still some lag for the NES Classic, it was a pretty decent offering, especially in comparison to a lot of virtual console titles, which looked terrible, especially on the Wii U.
Yes.
NES on the Wii U is a travesty.
Yeah, the colors are all wrong.
It's also super dark. It's very laggy. There's not a lot of filter options, which, you know, even just a few of the CRT filters and stuff, that stuff that people appreciate that make them think more like, I don't want to say the good old days, but it does invoke that certain warm, fuzzy feeling of nostalgia, but even more so than just nostalgia, which, like I said, they could have just went for pure nostalgia. Like, here you go, here's all our games on a box, $50. No, they went the extra mile. You get a poster that feels just like the old days. The controllers feel exactly the same, and they're quality. They are that Nintendo quality. They're not cheap plastic. I remember I was emulating some stuff in my last apartment. I asked my roommate to go buy me a USB SNES controller. I used that thing for 5 minutes and threw it at the wall. I was like, this is garbage. I immediately grabbed an adapter for a real SNES controller. But the NES controllers and the SNES Classic controllers, I love them. You can plug it into a Wii. It's like I basically have a wireless SNES controller. It's awesome. It does feel a little bit different, but the quality is there. All the third-party offerings can't touch it. It just feels more like a solid actual design. The material doesn't feel cheap in my hands. It's not light. The buttons are tactile and not super clicky. I'm not trying to explain the controller like it's the greatest thing in the world, but there is always a difference between first-party controllers and terrible third-party controllers, and any gamer that's been alive for 10 years knows that, at least.
Yes.
And because of that, Nintendo started the trend of the mini consoles. Now it wasn't an enthusiast thing anymore. Now people were rushing out to buy these things. It had the casual market up in a frenzy because of how well the promotion was done with it, as well as the shortage, because they learned from the Wii, oh, if we make less of it, more people will want it.
They've done that since the NES, arguably.
Yeah, that's just Nintendo's business model. It doesn't really arguably have too much to do with the quality of the product, but it probably does point to sales a bit. I mean, you can't argue also the at-game systems and stuff are obviously far cheaper to produce. There's a ton of them out there. They're practically worthless, in all honesty. Once they're out of the package, they're worthless.
Yeah, they're very cheap.
Yeah. And that's the thing, too. Quality matters. Quality over quantity, especially, because Nintendo, licensing-wise, picked pretty much some of the best games they possibly could for both the East and the West for their classic releases. And then following behind that, we had a good example of what not to do, which was the PlayStation Classic.
The PlayStation Classic is the offering that Sony debuted last holiday, or briefly before Black Friday, from what I remember. And it runs on the emulation platform PCXX Rearmed, which is a Linux... I mean, you can download it for the Windows, but it's an open source emulator. It came with a lot of games that weren't necessarily classics even back then. I mean, it has Final Fantasy VII, it has Metal Gear Solid, it has Rayman, but it has things like Destruction Derby, which feels like filler. And you can definitely tell that they tried to go and get some of the actual classics like Tomb Raider and Crash Bandicoot, but Activision and Square Enix probably told them just to go away.
Yeah, it's amazing they even got 7, to be honest, because if you look in the PlayStation Classic source code, it's there. It's there, but the real caveat though with the PlayStation Classic... The listing
Classic, for it is there, like a metadata for it.
Yeah, there's metadata for it, but the real problem with the PlayStation Classic wasn't even the titles, because, well, the NES Classic, SNES Classic, whether Nintendo intended or not, hacking them is stupidly easy. You can shove the entire library on both of them in some shape or form and have a ball. Even though it was great, they offered all these really rare titles, and an unreleased game too, Star Fox 2. You know, we did have it for years, mostly, really. I agree with you. Sony just does not get it, basically. They don't understand how to utilize their branding to appeal to both newcomers and their audience that's been built up and with them for years. I would still say most, like I said, consoles sell off either exclusives or multi-plat titles. Like a lot of PlayStation 4s just sell because I want to play Destiny and all my friends have PlayStations already, so I'm just going to get Destiny and a PS4. And that's fine.
Play the Sony tentpole movie games.
That's fine, but I feel like Nintendo's the only generation at this point of the 3 console manufacturers that's really holding on to that concept of their value over the years as building up their brands. where PlayStation and Xbox too, which does almost nothing in terms of remembering their past.
Halo Master Chief Collection, we're fixing it, guys. We're fixing it, guys. Here it is on PC. You have to buy them again.
I mean, it's fun to have Halo on PC because you can have mods and stuff, but like overall...
Name one other Xbox IP from the original Xbox that is still around today that isn't Halo.
I mean, you're counting on Xbox One, right?
Yes.
From Xbox to Xbox One, there isn't one. To be straight up honest with you, I don't think there is
instead, Microsoft is just buying studios and expecting them to shit out new games because that's what they do.
Titanfall. I have heard Titanfall was actually pretty decent.
They didn't buy Respawn. That's an EA company.
I know, but
my point is they're acquiring...
They push multi-plat titles like it's only available on their system.
True.
Way harder than anybody else does, I have noticed.
My point is Microsoft doesn't really have a strong set of IP. They just have generic games that sort of resemble their competition and don't necessarily have anything really interesting about them. They make the most generic Western games I can imagine for the absolute normie gamer.
Yep.
So they're completely separate from this whole nostalgia thing because they're such a late entrant into the arena in the first place.
They don't know how to do nostalgia. Like they don't even try to do nostalgia. They don't even do it. They just don't even try. Their definition of nostalgia is backwards compatibility and a re-release of the same games with absolutely no benefit, except for maybe not updated graphics, but updated resolution. Because you're not getting better graphics.
Yes.
Forget about that.
So outside,
you're not getting 4K Halo. Not yet.
Outside of the major hardware manufacturers, we're going to go and spotlight a couple of companies that go and try to do the nostalgia thing along the framework that we established of either re-releasing their old games or making new games in the spirit of the old games.
Actually, there's one more thing we need to touch on before we get to that.
Okay.
We talked about the mini consoles. Now we have to talk about the mini arcades. The 1-Up arcades, the re-released emulation boxes...
This is distinguishable from the MAME setups, which have been around since the 2000s.
Yeah, which I want to build soon.
Which anyone can... Like, there are kits for it. You can go and make one yourself. But you have to go and more or less do the work all yourself or have hundreds of dollars to go and buy one off of someone locally.
Yeah, so once again, average consumer, never going to touch it. Now
they can.
Yeah, enter 1-Up arcades and a few other clones like that. I've also seen a lot of like Pac-Man plus Galaga, which they look like the real thing. They're the same size. They're emulation.
Yeah, I've seen those...
Better quality than 1-Up at least, though.
I've seen those Namco things in random places that aren't even necessarily just a bar. I've seen them in like meeting centers where I've gone to like a meeting for like work.
Yeah.
Just have a Namco thing in like the lounge.
Yeah, they sell them to businesses and stuff. They usually stick them in a corner in the hopes of making some revenue off it. I mean, it probably still pays for itself after like a year, and it's just money after that until it breaks.
Yes.
So that's understandable, but the point is, again, before, those were actual arcade machines. They broke. You got to find somebody to actually understand CRTs, that understands JAMA connectors, because most people these days don't, unless you go that enthusiast route again. Now, Joe Schmo can go buy a stand-up arcade machine for his kids or for themselves, so they are kind of shorter, especially the 1-Up ones.
They're meant for kids.
They're meant for kids, but I don't feel like kids are the ones buying them, if you want the honest truth.
Man children.
Really are we man children? I've spent over $1,000 making my video game systems output 1080p, so I don't know.
You're more of like a wine person, but for games.
I like that. Thank you for making me feel more sophisticated, elegant in my obsession with what was essentially a child's toy years ago.
If you want to extend this metaphor, there's a difference between someone who buys box wine to drink like a wine mom and someone who buys the wine gadgets and the things that like make sure no air gets in the wine thing, like the electric corks, I guess.
Okay, I don't know anything about wine tasting or whatever that is, but to me it just sounds like somebody else that's basically just hardcore into their hobby, which is essentially what this is. And that's absolutely fine. But that's not what these things target.
Yes.
They target the casual consumer. It's like, oh, look, it's like a mini little Galaga. I'm going to buy that. And that's that.
But they're pieces of crap.
They are pieces of crap.
Like GameStop and ThinkGeek cannot sell these things. ThinkGeek, by the way, is kind of a side topic. But GameStop really loves pushing nerd crap on people. And to such an extent now, even more so than their games, they bought out the company ThinkGeek. They've opened up retail locations, and you can buy all the nerd crap you want at those locations, including the arcade stand-ups.
I have a better chance of finding the fucking, what do you call those things? The bobblehead things. What are they called again?
Funko Pops.
Funko Pops. I have a better chance of finding any random Funko Pop off the top of my head than I am to even, honestly, at this point, finding a random JRPG or PlayStation 3 fighting game that wasn't a generic one that was pushed out like crazy at GameStop at this point. Because the video game store is turning into nerdy merch. It's turning into another Hot Topic, practically. It's turning into nerd Hot Topic. Like, just remove all the gothic and, like, almost sexual stuff from Hot Topic, essentially. That was more so Spencer's thing, but Hot Topic started doing it. And that's what it is, Izzy. GameStop has gone from video games to token nerd store.
Yes.
Oh, you like Avengers? Oh, we got this $100 Avengers figure of Thor or Iron Man. Like, I want to buy video games, dude. Some people, don't get me wrong, they go hand in hand sometimes, but overall, it's not Electronics Boutique. It's not Funko Land.
It's not Babbage's.
Yeah, it's not a mom and pop store. Which at this point, if they can give you a decent deal, because some of them are kind of scummy.
Support your local indie game stores.
Yeah, as long as they're not ripping you off, like, please support your local stores, because
we're New Hampshire, bro. So go over to Core Gaming in Salem, New Hampshire.
Yeah, sure.
Not to advertise, but
go to Game Underground in Mass.
Yeah, they're
maybe you talk to some people behind the counter, but I'm not gonna push that. The point is support your local game stores. Anyway. GameStop can't do nostalgia to save their life. Especially because they're an awful, evil company that does not reward you for even thinking about nostalgia. In fact, it punishes you because you trade in your games, you get jack for them.
Yeah, power to the players, huh?
Yeah, the players and power to the people with the money.
Yes. So what we're going to move on to now is we're going to examine some of the third parties. We talked about the first parties, Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, in terms of what they're doing in terms of the nostalgia appeal. Now we're going to talk about some of the third parties.
Yes. Let's see. What do we
Less so on the Western third parties, because I think that the Eastern ones have a lot more of a rich history and investment into this sort of thing.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, when you think about it,
like Blizzard, what do they really do in terms of nostalgia appeal?
I mean,
they're doing things like WoW Classic, but that's not really within the same echelon of things that we're talking about.
Here's the thing I'll state real quick about Western developers before we move on to the Eastern developers. I think the relationship with Western developers and Western gamers in general, or gamers that prefer just Western games or solely focus on them, do not seem to have as much of an appreciation for the past, and therefore they don't really target it. Like, they re-released things like Modern Warfare 2, like Call of Duty and stuff, I believe, because it was the best-selling Call of Duty ever. But you're never going to really have a compilation of all the Call of Duties in the past. They're not going to sell because that demographic is purely focused on moving on to the next product.
They don't whenever their friends are playing.
Yeah, they don't like... I don't want to say they're not gamers, but they're definitely not gamers in the same sense that I think we are, if that makes any sense.
They're social gamers. They play because their friends are playing it.
It's the same sense of, like, I'm drinking because the rest of my friends are drinking. I'm smoking because the rest of my friends... I'm sorry to compare it to Vices, but it's kind of more similar to it. I watch X Sport because my friends do it.
People are nostalgic for individual Call of Duty entries. Like, the campaigns have a lot of great moments. A lot of people think Call of Duty Modern Warfare's campaign and Call of Duty 4's campaigns are some of the best FPS campaigns ever made.
They are actually. I enjoyed them. But the problem is they took that and copy and pasted it so many times they literally reused it cutscene by cutscene with different assets put over the models. I'm not joking.
And then people have nostalgia for Midway games. You know, WB owns Midway now.
Yeah,
Activision owning the Intellivision catalog, and Atari, whoever owns Atari now, trying to push Atari games.
And that's part of the issue there too. A lot of Western developers get traded around over the years, or are completely defunct, and the property is now owned by somebody else that might not even be interested as much in, like Mortal Kombat 11. There's not a lot of interest there in talking about nostalgia. I'm not going to get into this entirely, but it's not the same thing. It's not where we remember our roots and we carry it forward, because it's not even the same company. It's not the same developers. I mean,
Ed Boon's still there.
Yeah, that's true. But, it's not the same thing as in Miyamoto's been there since Mario Brothers.
Miyamoto has worked at Nintendo since he was 18.
Yes.
That was when you would go and sleep in the company dorms after you're done working.
That's an
he was a wonderkind of Nintendo in their arcade division. He had so much clout.
I wish I was a wonderkin. I wish I was a wonder anything at this point, besides wondering why I'm not dead yet. But anyway, so that's the reason why we're not going to put too much of a focus on Western developers for nostalgia. But I would like to state this before getting to the Eastern ones. If you think that we're wrong regarding this and that we should do something in terms of nostalgia with Western developers, let us know, and we'll do further research on that, and maybe we'll actually look into that. Because it would be interesting. I'm sure it does exist, but it's definitely more seldom, and it's going to take more research than this is.
Here's what I would say. I believe that people who are older than us have more nostalgia for Western retro stuff. I think the same crowd that's interested in old Midway games, in old Atari games, are the same sort of people who really like pinball games. I mean, there's like young people who like pinball games.
My girlfriend does. I have no idea how, but she does, and she's 25.
But I'd argue that a lot of people who are into Western retro games are in like their 30s and 40s now.
Yeah.
So it's a completely...
old school, not retro.
And they also have more money to go and buy the original cabinets, and they might not be super interested in these $20, $30 compilations for consoles they might not own. 30, 40-year-old people, like... They might own a console, they might not, their kids might own one. I don't think a lot of people, unless they've been gaming their whole life, are going to go out and buy a PS4. If they only played arcade games when they were a kid and then they got a job and they fell out of gaming, what is so interesting about a PS4? Why would you pay $400 for a PS4 just to play an Atari game?
Yeah, it's like the same sense of somebody that essentially stopped really focusing on music and just kind of listens to stuff on Spotify. They're not going to go out and buy like expensive records and stuff and get a really good record player to get that best quality. It's just they're not an audiophile. It's not what they're into.
It's an interesting topic because vinyl as a market is coming back in a big way.
It is, but it's still never going to be bought by the casual market. No, 9 times out of 10, you walk in a house, you're not going to find a record player.
Although, I bring
Except
that up,
maybe in an attic.
I bring it up, but it's also like, do people buy only vinyl of new records that are new today? Are they buying reissues of old records, remasters? It's funny to use that term in terms of records, but that's the original thing. You go and remaster an album, you go and improve how the album sounded, and then it sounds a lot better now. That's the original use of the term.
That's not quite accurate, though. And that's an interesting point, though, because...
It's a comparison, yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's a good comparison, because also... Video games themselves were originally still thought of as a children's thing. I'm not going to lie. They start off as a toy, essentially. But now it's also kind of trendy to also be into games, especially retro theme games or old school games in general. Kind of makes you almost like that hipster kind of mentality.
But are they seeking this stuff out on their own? If the companies didn't go and push this stuff out, was it a post facto thing? Did they recognize that there's an interest in it and then they went and put out the product? Or is it people actively seeking it out and saying, I'm interested in this because of its own merits, just not because it's trendy, but because I'm genuinely interested in it? That's how you can tell a difference between a gaming hipster and someone who's genuinely like a gaming nerd.
Right, and the thing is, the reason why the classic consoles and stuff work is because they hit both markets, whereas like the plug-and-play stuff only really hit casuals that were never going to go buy an arcade machine. We're never going to go seek out the original cartridges.
Yes.
Like I said, there's like basically 3 demographics. You have casual, which are like
This
parents.
is the Frank Cifaldi taxonomy he mentioned in one of his GDC talks.
Yeah, but he made a very good point. You have casuals, then you have kind of the middle ground where they're into gaming. They probably have all the modern systems, but they're not like super hardcore into the past stuff. And then you have the enthusiasts that are into either super into only old school stuff or into absolutely everything, which is basically us. Aside from a few differences in taste, we've played every single system and stuff on PC. Sure, we won't play everything. Nobody on the planet can. But we've had our hands on every single genre from the 80s to now. That yes. I can guarantee you in some point. And a lot of people never will.
Yes.
We're the hardest thing to reach by far, because we have a ton of things to do. Casuals...
snobs.
Yeah, kinda. Casuals just want it now and want it fast, because they got kids to get back to, they have a social life. I just insulted myself there. More of a social life, I guess. Because they enjoyed socializing. Who the hell enjoys socializing? Well,
enjoy socialism.
Who enjoys peace? Oh God, who enjoys people? I just want to spend my nights just curled up in a corner with a blanket over my head, saving Hyrule. Sometimes that feels good. It's what I want to do. And in the middle ground, like I said, has probably the newest consoles, but probably trade all their old stuff into GameStop. So they really, lost their original collection, and they might be more nostalgic for the old things. They might buy the clone consoles, maybe some cartridges now and then, but they're not going to go balls to the wall, recreating a collection or anything. And they'll probably find more value in the classic consoles or the arcade one-up stuff and things like that. Now, what do you do when you don't have those options and companies know that? Now we're going to discuss individual companies, and we're going to focus on the Eastern companies because they're the ones mainly doing this. But like I said, if there's Western examples, let us know in the comments below.
I mean, every company in the West, the companies that own the rights to these games, there are retro compilations that come out, but you don't see a lot of them making new games that have the spirit of the original titles they made.
Or even, for the record, owned by the original publisher or company or developer that made them.
Like, the IP might be around still. Mortal Kombat is still around. It's been around since the 90s, but Mortal Kombat 11 is a much different game than Mortal Kombat 2.
Yes, by far. And we're not going to get into the logistics of that, but Midway's gone, THQ's gone, Sierra Games is gone. A lot of the PC developers...
A lot of them have been absorbed or otherwise acquired.
Atari is not Atari. I don't know what they are.
I believe Atari is still Infogram, but I'm not quite sure about that. I don't know who owns we don't know who owns Atari now. Isn't that sad?
Somebody apparently told Nintendo, hey, Pac-Man's good to go, though. Throw it in there. But I haven't.
That's Namco.
Oh, that's Namco. Oh, that is Namco. Isn't there an Atari thing in Smash Brothers?
No.
No? All right, that's Namco. So yeah, no one knows who the hell owns Atari. I'm an idiot. My bad.
But a lot of the examples that I ended up coming up with were Eastern because I believe they have a much more holistic view of their history and how they keep these ideas alive. So one big example we'll go and illustrate it along the lines of what's their remasters, re-releases like, and what are their new games like, and whether they follow the spirit of the original. So Capcom. One example I want to go and bring up is another Frank Cifaldi example he came up with in his GDC talk. His first one in 2016 is the Uncle Buck example. So the movie Uncle Buck, which was a John Hughes movie with John Candy and Macaulay Culkin, came out in 1990-something, and then it's been available in one form or another on multiple formats since it came out, and it's never not been available in some capacity. Because the movie industry is a lot better about doing that sort of thing than the games industry is. Because it costs very little for them to go and put it on a different format and print these discs, because there is a market for it. People will buy it again if they remember it. They package it with other things, they market it in different ways, so they know how to do it. But what often ends up happening is you can't buy certain games that might be important to the history of a particular company because they've only been released on one platform, or they're otherwise, due to their hardware that it was released with, or the way it was designed, or the way the graphics work, or the rights to it, or licensing involved. You can't see it again for multiple reasons in the game industry. So there's giant holes in the history, and that's really sad. But what Capcom in particular, I think Capcom has definitely understood this. So the whole Resident Evil series, the mainline games, you can almost play every single one of them on the PlayStation 4.
Yep.
Resident Evil 1, well, you can't play the original Resident Evil 1, but you can play the remake of Resident Evil 1. You can play Resident Evil 2, the remake, on the PS4, but you can't necessarily play the original Resident Evil 2.
You can play Resident Evil 1 and 2 on it on the PlayStation 4. Can't you just get on the PSN Classics?
No.
Really?
No.
Well, the director's cut.
Okay, let me go and reframe this. So Resident Evil 1 through 3, the PlayStation 1 versions you can't play on the PS4, but you can still buy them on like the PS3 for now. I think they're going to shut the PSN down for the PS3 soon.
Ugh, yeah, that's why I don't like digital. But
and then okay, let me reframe this. Resident Evil 4 through 7 you can play on the PS4. You can go into the store, you can go to Best Buy now, and for $20 you can buy a Resident Evil 4 on a disc if you want.
You know what? I still think there's a way to get Resident Evil 1 through 3, though, digitally, period, though.
Only on the PS3 PSN store.
Alright, well, at least it's there, because there's no way to play certain games still. There's absolutely no way to play certain Dreamcast games ever again.
You can't play Metal Gear Solid 1. I'll mention it in the Konami thing, but in short, Capcom, I think, has figured out how to go and get the games that are at least somewhat compatible with modern systems to be playable on each new generation of consoles.
Yeah, and I mean, they also released their collections, the Mega Man...
Legacy Collection.
Legacy Collection. So they originally did this with the PS2, the GameCube, and the Xbox. I think there's an Xbox version.
Yes.
The Anniversary Collections. Highly recommend. If you're not going to play the original cartridge, I highly recommend the Anniversary Collection. It is fantastic.
Legacy is a little more modern.
It is, but it comes with less. Anniversary Collection has the power battles on it, and it goes up to Mega Man 8. And the X Collection is debatable. The X Anniversary Collection on the PlayStation 2, and I think it's on the GameCube as well, is X 1 through 6. So it's less games on that one. But arguably, the emulation's a bit better. The X Collection is split into 2 games. I believe it's 2 discs for the PS4, or it's 1 cartridge on the Switch. The other is a download only. You can't get 2 cartridges for the Switch for the X Collection. The X Collection is X1 through 8, which is for better or for worse, in all honesty, especially with X7. But it also comes with the boss battle mode. And this is something I really want to touch on with Capcom, is Capcom, they have made some mistakes in the past in terms of understanding what makes fans happy, as well as how to use their brand. This is really important, actually. Something I don't think you're touching on is Resident Evil, Mega Man, Devil May Cry are some of their biggest titles that have carried them throughout the years. And all 3 of them have stumbled horribly in the past at a certain point, being unable to either adapt to the current times or force focus onto a totally different and wider demographic that was not happy with it. And I'm just going to name some very simple examples. Resident Evil 5 and 6 have their fans, but are
they're Western focused.
They're Western focused, and they're a massive departure from Resident Evil 1 through 3, and even somewhat 4. 4 was kind of more so the beginning departure from it, but by 5 and 6, it's unrecognizable. It's the same characters and totally different gameplay. And the Umbrella Corps is just straight up a bad game. Period. Story might be interesting, but the gameplay itself is bad. It's very bad, big open shooter.
It's just a Call of Duty game.
It's basically Call of Duty in Raccoon City, which is dumb. Anyway, the point is, well, you liked it or not, fans didn't. It didn't do well. And the reason why was these games also, they were outsourced. They weren't developed by Capcom internally because Capcom was afraid that their games weren't doing as well as they did during the earlier generations, because now Western developers were more so appealing to a more casual market. The non-enthusiasts, the Call of Duty and the Halo players. I mean, there's some hardcore Halo players. They're more towards that, but like Call of Duty, Battlefield, all these first-person shooters especially, and then all the sports games, NFL, Madden. This is the casual audience for next-gen systems. They only want to play the popular stuff everybody else is playing. They don't really care as much about the past, and they never did. That's just the kind of market it is. And they were upset they were losing them, so they tried to make games that were more Western focused. They did this with Devil May Cry by outsourcing it and trying to make it as different as possible with a daunting nobody liked. It didn't go well.
It didn't have the spirit of the original Devil May Cry games at all.
No, it did not. And they used a Western developer again, and they kind of forced their hand to really change around. They reproduced Mega Man 9 and 10 as a very retro, because it was a new game imitating an old style, which to moderate success, but of course doesn't touch the sales of the more casual market. And Resident Evil was abysmal, was trying to touch that. They tried to make up the multiplayer aspects of Operation Raccoon City, and those were bad. They did not really do well at all. They weren't well-made games. And the audience, they want to make a wider audience, but the audience that already liked Resident Evil, liked the survival horror, liked Devil May Cry, liked the hack and slash action and Dante's cocky attitude, that liked Mega Man Legends 3, which was canceled, or the Mega Man World that was canceled too. All these things,
Mega Man
people
Universe.
that they liked were canceled in favor of trying to get a better market share from people that never had any interest in their IPs in the first place. And it hurt them bad. As well as re-releasing titles on mobile platforms with terrible touchscreen controls that were made for a controller because they're side-scrollers, for crying out loud.
It's also important to clarify that the reason why a lot of Japanese publishers struggled within a couple generations ago is because when the shift to HD consoles, such as the 360 and the PlayStation 3 happened, a lot of these developers weren't necessarily able to go and get to that level of graphical fidelity. Some of them were, like Square Enix has always been at the pinnacle of making sure their graphics are top of the top cinematic quality. But then some of the smaller publishers, they couldn't afford to make games that were impressive in their minds to Western audiences. That's why many of them were outsourced.
Right.
It's also important to note that... Right, go on.
I just wanted to state, though, despite what I wanted to finish up Capcom, though, despite what I was saying.
It's building off of what I was saying for Capcom.
Yes, this is important, because I think it's a very good direction to move forward with regarding other companies of what Capcom's doing now. Capcom essentially, after dealing with these losses and this issue of outsource their games, moved development back to internally like they were doing in their early days for the 8, 16-bit, 32-bit, even 120-bit systems up until the PS3, Wii 360 era where they started outsourcing stuff. Back to in-house, and they decide, you know what, we're just going to make games that we enjoy that have the same special appeal as the old ones. And then you get Resident Evil 7, which returned to survival horror after Resident Evil 6, which felt like a bad Mission Impossible movie, if you want the honest truth.
Resident Evil 7 is the best VR game this generation.
I haven't played it on VR, so I don't know, but honestly, it probably would be. I have to do that eventually.
It was made for VR.
Yeah, but you can play without it, though, and I heard it's still fantastic. But the point is, it went back to the survival horror roots. That's what matters. They went back to what they did, and it sold great. Then they did the remake of Resident Evil 2, and it sold great. Even Monster Hunter, which never actually fell from grace. It has its hardcore fans that never really stopped playing it. But World, I noticed a lot of people just somehow hit it where they got it right, and it appealed to the masses and the hardcore players all the same. And then with the Resident Evil 2 remake, as we talked about earlier, again, it played off nostalgia, of course, because it was a remake, but it was a remake in every sense of the word, where they improved things and didn't just bring it into HD. They took away the stuff from older games, like the tank controls, that, quite frankly, it wouldn't have sold as well if it had tank controls, and I know that. That was a limitation of the technology at the time, not the developer's vision or intentions. That is the right thing to improve, but the feel is very much the same. And of course, while the extra modes, characters playable and stuff, Hank, you can play as Tofu. Silly stuff like this that we don't get that much anymore, honestly. Like years ago, you had like DK mode in rare games where you have big heads like Donkey Kong. Like, you know, funny little things like this, we don't get that much anymore because developers are so focused on pushing out a generic product, they forget to have fun.
Even Nintendo is guilty of that to some degree. A lot of people criticize their RPGs because there must have been some internal mandate for Nintendo to ensure that their IPs were recognizable. So therefore, when they go and remake games like Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, what ends up happening is a lot of the unique-looking Toad characters are replaced with just different colored Toads.
Yep.
So I think that's probably some sort of internal mandate to ensure that everything looks consistent, everyone can recognize what a Mario character is. So that removes a lot of the weirdness out of it. That's also why Paper Mario became so generic, is probably because Nintendo was paranoid that Mario was losing its brand value, so therefore they wanted to ensure that people could know what Mario is and expect things from a Mario game.
Which is upsetting, because Paper Mario was essentially originally the successor to Mario RPG, which is one of the best Super Nintendo games ever made. The only time Nintendo and Square ever collaborate on a title, as far as I know. And to this day is basically legendary.
Yeah, but that's sort of an example I came up with on the spot for that sort of thing, a contrary example.
So to finish off Capcom, though, because when we move to the next developers, you'll see why I'm praising Capcom in terms of direction. Their most recent title, Devil May Cry 5, I mentioned earlier that their Devil May Cry reboot, DMC, unlikable characters, unlikable story, it got some people to like it, but generally speaking, they were people that were never fans of it. So people are kind of divided on it now, but overall, the reception for it was poor. It was not what Capcom wanted. It also painted the developers with a really negative light forever, the one they outsourced it to, Ninja Theory. You know, it was mostly Capcom's fault, I found out later on.
Capcom ordered this developer to go and update Dante to a modern design, in effect?
Yeah, the main character, Devil May Cry, was essentially based off what was cool in the 80s and 90s in Japan, and they wanted the new Dante to be what's cool in the West in, like, the 2000s. So instead of making him kind of a cocky, fun-loving guy that just enjoys killing demons and eating pizza, quite frankly, to be honest, they made him a douchebag. And nobody liked him.
They made it into like a grunge douchebag.
Well, first he was like really kind of emo, and he smoked, which, I mean, don't get me wrong, I understand everybody has their vices,
but that's not Dante.
No, it's not. It's a totally different character, and the reception was terrible, so they dialed it back, and they kind of came up with this weird, bizarre fusion of Dante and this emo Dante they showed off in an E3 trailer that was horribly received. And nobody liked it. Also, the dialogue was terrible. The amount of obscenities, the poor writing. I'm not going to go any further. Point is, game didn't do as well as they wanted, and fans were angry. Enter Devil May Cry 5. This game is doing fantastic. Reviews are super high all throughout. And the game is everything in the spirit of the original Devil May Cry with the creative director, Hideki Itsuno, who led Devil May Cry 4. Is absolutely happy with it. They're doing great, and they stated, even in his GDC talk, which I have to finish when I finish the game, we set out to create a game that we were going to enjoy, and they didn't really bother looking at the market. So Devil May Cry 5 isn't 100% just like the old ones. It's evolved. Nero's the main character now, but
there's still plenty of Dante for you.
Yeah, there's still plenty of Dante. The gameplay feels far more... It's harder, because DMC was superly easy. Another thing, Devil May Cry fans love their difficulty. They love the challenge. It's Devil May Cry 3 is one of the hardest games ever made. Basically, it was just the right formula to make things work. And I think a lot of companies should take notice of this that are struggling. And with that, I'm seeing a bright future for Capcom. Make Mega Man X9. And then, you know what? Make some new IPs. I'm really curious to see what their internal development team can do now that they're not focusing so much on demographics, what demographics want, but, back in the old days, like, you know what people wanted. Let's just make something that everybody in the office enjoys and see what happens. I think that's kind of a more beautiful and genuine, honest approach to game development.
Yes.
But now I'm going to turn to you with SNK, because you know more about this developer than I do.
So I'm going to talk about SNK, and even though there's another company that I think we should mention that wasn't on the outline, Sega.
We mentioned them already a lot with the classic consoles.
But also, you mentioned Dante, but I want to provide another example. Sonic.
Fair enough. Go ahead. We'll start with that.
Sonic, when he was designed in the early 90s, was meant to appeal to American children. He was meant to be a cocky, wise Alec, doesn't care about authority, does what he wants, cool character. How did that character evolve into the 2000s with Sonic Adventure? He became a skateboarder.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't lose his total tone, but he definitely became more edgy.
He became less...
He went from Okay, Sonic, I want to say the best way I could describe it.
He went from
Bugs Bunny.
He went from being Urkel to Tony Hawk.
Okay, kinda. I was going to say Bugs, but yeah. I mean, I know the cartoon was voiced by Urkel, but
it's a different sort of cool. Like, I would argue 90s cool was all about being kind of anti-authority, being sort of like a jokester.
Attitude.
And then...
Tubular. Ninja Turtles, Happen, that kind of stuff.
The 2000s were more about being kind of grungy, being more or less kind of a little bit edgy. Like, athleticism was a big thing. That's why Sonic did a lot of extreme sports.
Adventure was 1999, though.
You get my point, though.
Yeah.
1990, which is when Sonic came out, and 1999 are completely different culturally.
Yeah, 9 years can do a lot.
So, and plus, Sega's been very good about releasing their back catalog and everything ever. They do Sonic compilations, they do the Genesis compilations. The Genesis is one of the most emulated commercial platforms in existence, I would argue.
Yeah, that's also because the fact that Genesis had was cheaper than NES almost, and the Nintendo's offerings in general.
They also had a nicer licensing agreement, I think.
Yes, Genesis definitely allowed more games to be developed for it. You know, Super Nintendo's library is insane. Genesis is larger, isn't it?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, the NES lasted for a lot longer because
not the NES, the Super Nintendo. 16-bit versus 16-bit.
I would have to look at the count of like by the region, but I do remember that Genesis had a lot more Western games because Sega was a lot more about ensuring that. What happened with the NES is that there were Western developers for it, but it was more or less like kind of curated. Like you had Rare, I can't think of a lot of like NES specific Western developers.
Well, it was honestly all the developers we have these days. EA and Activision were on there.
Right, but what I would argue with this is that the Genesis was more of a global product than the SNES was.
Yes, it was. I also think it has to do with like international barriers too. Like when the Genesis, the Master System, just Sega in general, was more popular, like South America,
yes,
like Brazil. It was just easier to get them because Sega allowed other companies to produce clone consoles or things similar for, well, I'm just gonna say it, no offense, less fortunate countries that are more dealing with issues like poverty and stuff.
In terms of Brazil does have laws involving when you produce a piece of hardware in Brazil, it has to be made using like Brazilian factories or something to that effect, and you have to pay like levy taxes on it. If you're buying a product from overseas, there's lots of taxes applied onto it to benefit the Brazilian economy. So a PS4 is like $500+ there.
Yeah. And Nintendo stuff is always expensive anyway because people kind of joke around say it's the Nintendo tax because their brand is so strong. I'm be honest with you, their stuff does not drop in price. Even GameCube games now are like almost back to retail.
Point is, Sega was more or less about. Nintendo was so draconian about their publishing practices since the NES that Sega coming along and saying you can do what you want was a big boon to their relationship with Western publishers. They still had a very strong internal development team. They made some of the best arcade and console games ever made. I'll say that about Sega. But I would argue that they were much nicer to publishers and Western third parties, and that really allowed the Genesis, not all consoles for Sega necessarily, just the Genesis to thrive. But the Saturn, it was much more delineated, much more Japan-focused again.
You could also argue Sega's leniency is what allowed them to take over that 52% market share of the U.S. during the console wars in the early to mid-90s.
Sega was a lot smart. Sega really got an edge on Nintendo in that regard.
Yes.
So I would argue Sega is doing a great job at ensuring people remember Sega games while also making new games that are in the spirit of the original. Like, I'll just say two words: Sonic Mania.
Yeah, that's all you gotta say.
Sonic Mania is one of the best retro-style games available right now. It is the platonic Sonic game. Aside from Sonic the Hedgehog, if you've never played any Sonic game somehow, I would give you Mania and you would get it.
Yeah,
Mania has a lot of nostalgia appeal. A lot of the stages are cribbed from the originals and remixed in a lot of ways, but it is the perfect Sonic game. Yeah. You can't get any better than Mania or Mania Plus at this point because that is some new content. That is the perfect retro. It's one of the best examples of a game made in the retro style I can think of.
Correct, but the thing is, it was also made by fans.
It was made by Christian Whitehead and his team over at Team Hammerhead, I think?
Yeah.
So point is, Christian Whitehead was a dude... We're getting a little off subject, but Christian Whitehead was a hacker in the Sonic fan scene who went and reverse engineered the Sonic engine and made perfect ports of the Sonic engine to iOS and to other platforms and effectively made an engine he could put on any console you could think of, and he presented this to Sega, and they were like, okay, you can go and make this for us. And so he went and made a couple of their commercial products for them. He made the Sonic CD port, he made the Sonic 1 and 2 ports for iOS, and then eventually the idea of making an original Sonic game, the original Sonic style, came up, and they were like, well, we clearly trust you since you were able to go and deliver on these products, so let's go and do it. So that's a rare example of the fans being given effectively the grace of the original company owning the IP to make a new game perfectly in the style of the original. That's why I say that's a completely ideal situation.
Yeah, and it's rare because Sega also developed their Sonic games moving further and further away from the original formula, which found an audience. Not a big audience, but an audience, and now
people love Adventure and Adventure 2. If they were to make a game that is honestly like that and not terrible anime garbage, then I think it would have an audience.
Hey, Yeah, so I'll just list them: Sonic 06,
Sonic Forces,
Sonic and the Secret Ring, Sonic and the Black Knight, Sonic Unleashed. Just kind of like,
I think Sonic Team doesn't know what they're doing because they're being forced to make the same game over and over again. Team Sonic Racing doesn't look that original. It has just, if you know the game Onrush, it has the team racing mechanics and less of a focus on getting first place and more or less just doing stuff and doing tricks.
Just play Sonic Riders. You'll never want to play
I don't know why
Sonic Racing game again.
I don't think Sega knows what they're doing in terms of like the mainline Sonic games anymore.
No, but somehow there is an audience for this. It's very small and honestly not profitable, but it's there. So
Sonic fans are crazy still, and sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. There's a difference between Chris Chan and Christian Whitehead.
Yeah, which just very quickly, some Sonic fans are not right in the head. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah,
they have some serious mental issues, but well-meaning people for the most part, and for those people,
very passionate.
They still make things like Sonic Forces, which was definitely not made for our demographic.
Well, it has it has like make your own Sonic character. It's clearly made for some sort of fan.
It's made for the people that make Sonic OCs on DeviantArt. That's the nicest thing I can basically say in terms of that fan base.
Okay, so now we move.
So that's your cake, have your cake and eat it too analogy. That's what Sega's doing. That's why Sega's so lenient with fans doing whatever, because that's pretty much all they can go off of at this point.
A smaller company I wanted to mention while we're on the topic is SNK, which is a company that's existed since at least the 80s. And in one form or another, they've released arcade games, they've released a series of popular fighting games such as the King of Fighters series, and I think they're probably the gold standard in terms of a smaller, mid-sized company in Japan that knows the value of their back catalog and is able to re-release their games each generation, either digitally or physically. And then, nowadays, they're able to go and make newer games that are perfectly in the spirit of their original titles. So, every generation you get either individual releases of King of Fighters, 93, 94, 95, 2000, etc. But then, you can see these characters in the new King of Fighters game, King of Fighters 14, which came out on the PlayStation 4, and now they're making a new Samurai Showdown game. You can buy Samurai Showdown 1 through 3 pretty easily. They release these compilations all the way from... During the PS1, you could buy the games when they were new, because in 98, you could just buy the 1998 version on the PS1. But then, by the PS2, you could buy the compilations. They had a fairly long, I think, 15 or something title series over on the PlayStation 2 that we didn't really get any of because there's not as much nostalgia for it. And then what ended up happening by the 360 era is that they had a lot of internal issues. They were adjusting to HD development. They made a Samurai Showdown game called Samurai Showdown Sen that resembled in a lot of ways Street Fighter 4, but it was just not really well received. But they really emerged from that tough period and survived as a company, and now they're making games that are perfectly in the spirit of their original titles. Samurai Showdown looks great. King of Fighters 14, well, it's not as popular as Street Fighter 5 or Mortal Kombat 11. It's still a very well put together game, and it features characters from all throughout their arcade and console history. You have Athena from the Psycho Soldier games as a playable character. You have a bunch of cameos from other games. You have a couple of Final Fight characters in there. So I'm highlighting that company as more or less an example of a smaller company that can still not lose themselves in the transition between generations and maintain the spirit of their back catalog.
Yeah, they do a decent job focusing on it. One thing I would note with them, though, is in terms of the craze with the mini consoles, SNK, for starters, they
own the Neo Geo catalog.
That's a big deal,
omission.
And that is a big nostalgia trip, Neo Geo, because there's really nothing like that anymore.
Neo Geo was like the connoisseurs of the arcades in the early 90s.
Yes, and also
those who like Neo Geo.
Yeah, it's not a thing a lot of people still even know about. A lot of people don't even know what Neo Geo is. The Neo Geo console and the games, this wasn't something that you asked mom to buy for you when you were a kid. This was for already adults that played Neo Geo games or somebody with really rich parents. These were expensive. you had to be upper class to play this. The system was, what it launched? $600?
Yes.
And the games were like $100 a piece, because minimum.
They were perfect to the arcade versions.
Yes, that thing wasn't like... A big selling point of the Genesis was bring the arcade experience home, which actually wasn't true. The Genesis was still kind of behind arcade hardware, just slightly. Like, it wasn't exactly like arcade, but it was still miles ahead of what NES was doing at the time, or any other competitors. But no... AVS, Neo Geo's home console, it was an arcade machine on your CRT TV in the, late 80s, early 90s?
Yes.
Yeah, 100%
more than
accurate.
The 90s, the mid-90s.
Yeah, 100% accurate representation. Not emulation, it's the real deal, and it's still expensive as hell to this day. Arguably more, adjusted for inflation.
Then, meanwhile, we have companies such as Konami, which...
Well, the one thing I want to touch on with SNK, though, before you go off them, is in terms of the mini consoles, they tried their hand at this too, and they also are an example of stumbling.
Neo Geo Gold.
Neo Geo X.
Oh, yes.
That thing was an example of poorly outsourced emulation device. It was sold for a very high price. It was like this weird, almost cheap-feeling PSP thing that you... stuck inside a plastic Neo Geo case that was hollow with a composite input for your TV. The emulation was bad. Your PC could do a better job than this, and it sold out really fast. Then they tried again with this new arcade release that had HDMI and a tiny little screen, and it's okay. It's better than the Neo Geo X. But I think SNK isn't realizing they don't have the reach that Nintendo does, or even Sega does.
They have a dedicated audience, though.
They do, but they're never going to have that same reach, though.
Yeah.
And because of that, their offerings aren't always of the same quality as something like Nintendo's would be, or even Capcom, for that matter.
Definitely, but at least they're trying.
They are trying, and I give them credit for it, especially with the 40th Anniversary Collection, which contained a ton of games that nobody ever even heard of.
And Digital Eclipse, Frank Cifaldi's company, had a big hand in that.
Yep.
And it's a good example because they had an active collaboration with SNK to get that documentation. Yep. What happens a lot is that a lot of Japanese companies either throw things out or they work on things for the future and they don't really... Sometimes they just kind of ignore their old games until they make these classic things and they just kind of like stop after that.
Yeah, pretty much. Sometimes companies just don't care anymore because of revenue, which is Konami. Sad but true. That's business.
And that's a good segue into Konami.
Yeah, now you can go to Konami. I know you've been wanting to.
So Konami, despite all their recent gaffes, does have a very extraordinary back catalog. And by the way, they are celebrating an anniversary this year.
Yep.
50th, right?
Yep.
So what are they doing for that 50th anniversary? Not a whole lot. So what was released very recently on digital only was their shooting collection, which had a lot of their shoot 'em up games. I don't exactly remember the list of games, but I think it's like 6 to 8 games.
Yeah.
For $20.
So like vertical and horizontal shooters.
Yes. Like the Gradius
games.
Gradius,
yeah, because Gradius is obviously in DDR and stuff.
And then you also have the Castlevania collections.
Yep.
So before the 50th anniversary, last year they released a compilation of 2 games, Symphony of the Night and Rondo of Blood, on the PlayStation 4, digital only. Which, it's the PSP versions of the games, literally stolen from the PSP version from the mid-2000s. It's not really anything you should... Like, if you want to play it on your PS4, fine, but there are millions of other ways to play these games.
Yeah, which I'll give Konami credit for, at the very least, in terms of a lot of their more hardcore titles in back catalog. Most of them could be played on other platforms. Some of them, now some more rare titles, even in the series, like Castlevania Bloodlines and Kid Dracula, were completely unavailable until this new collection now, which is nice of them to be doing. I'm curious, though, as to what the quality is going to be, because they released Symphony of the Night for absolutely everything possible. It started with the Xbox 360 arcade and snowballed from there. So that was re-released constantly. But Konami doesn't... Like, they try to put effort into celebrating their heritage, but at the same time, they have a lot of very not consumer, but anti-fan, I think, ideologies that don't make sense regarding their actual hardcore titles. One such example I want to say right off the bat is Metal Gear Solid.
Yes.
And anything involving Hideo Kojima in general, which most gamers that follow Konami or Silent Hill or Metal Gear know for a fact that Hideo Kojima was excommunicated out of Konami and no longer has anything to do with them and is working on a totally different project. But Konami does not understand at all what their fans want. They removed a demo for what was going to be the new Silent Hill for the PS3, which if you still have it, congrats.
PS4.
Or was it PS4? Oh yeah, PS4, my bad. Or PS4. Would you still have it, congrats, because it's worth, what, hundreds if it still has it on it? Like almost $1,000? It's a big deal. Because there's no way to back it up.
It is the only game that they requested Sony that you couldn't re-download it from the PlayStation Network.
Not true. Well, Konami, but you also can't get Scott Pilgrim.
Well, that's a completely different situation.
I'm just saying.
That's a licensing issue.
It is. I'm just saying. Anyway, the point is, though, so what they do with Metal Gear, they made a game called Metal Gear Survive that doesn't appeal to really anybody, that changed Metal Gear from a tactical espionage game with a heavy focus on story, action cutscenes similar to that of like a 007 movie and like gadgets and stuff. And
to a zombie shooter.
Yeah, pretty much a bad zombie shooter at that.
They're not zombies. They're time crystallized beings.
They look
I looked up the lore for this. It's kind of dumb.
They look like the Left 4 Dead, zombies with dildos on their heads. I'm not even going to sugarcoat it because that's how much I hate this game. It's the truth of it. And they just acted like nothing was wrong. Silent Hill's dead. They've done nothing with Contra. They've done nothing with Castlevania except for this re-release. Oh, that's not true. Wait a minute. They re-released Castlevania by outsourcing developers. How well did that work for Capcom?
Not very well. Lords of Shadow is not very well. For the uninitiated. The Lords of Shadow series was a God of War-esque sort of series that they tried to do for the PlayStation 3 and 360 by Spanish developer Mercury Steam.
To be clear, Castlevania Lords of Shadow. Lords of Shadow is not its own thing. It's a Castlevania game. It's a bad Castlevania series. The first one was like a mediocre God of War clone. The 3DS one, I don't even know what that was supposed to be.
Mirror of Fate was just meant to be a Metroidvania, but it's not very good.
No, it's a bad Metroidvania. That's the best way to put it. And Lords of Shadow 2 is an abomination. There's no other way to put it. It's awful.
There's a fun screenshot that really reveals they made the player character model a slightly different size than the rest of the environment. So you have cars that are just fucking ginormous.
Yeah.
Next to this giant hulking player character.
Yeah, the development for that game was all over the place. And the worst thing about it, even if the game was actually good, it absolutely spit on the history of Castlevania. Even worse than you could say DMC to Devil May Cry, which have way less of a history than Castlevania anyway. They rewrote characters to be completely different. They threw it in a weird modern setting. They threw in, almost like aliens and stuff. It's just, I don't know what this game was supposed to be, but it's bad, and for some reason they got Patrick Stewart
to be really bored when he narrates things.
I mean, his voice sounds entertaining, don't get me wrong, but like, what?
It's like hiring
Why?
It's like hiring the 24 dude for Metal Gear 5.
Did they do that?
Yeah.
Oh.
They instead of David Hayter, it's Kiefer Sutherland for Big Boss.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
It sounds bad.
He doesn't talk a lot in the game because it's expensive to hire Kiefer Sutherland.
Point is, when it comes to core titles and continuing the franchise and treating it with respect, Konami doesn't do that.
Konami just doesn't like to acknowledge the past. So they tried the HD collection stuff in the previous gen, but they had lots of weird like, okay, if you have a 360 and you want to play Metal Gear Solid, what do you get to play? Oh, you get to play 2 and 3 and Peace Walker. Have fun.
Yep.
It's just like a little hunk of the games. These random games that they got the source code for. Or, in the case of the Silent Hill HD collection, what they did is they lost the source code, so they made whatever poor developer they hired to make this HD collection, they had to reverse engineer like the PC copies or some crap like that.
It was the PC copy, yeah.
And because of that, the second one was a lot different than the original release.
Like the lighting is different, the graphics look a lot worse. They're
it's very it's got like it's kind of that issue with a lot of HD remasters where it looks like someone just smeared Vaseline over the screen.
But again, it's a weird case of, okay, you want to play Silent Hill and you're 360, okay, here's 2 and 3. Okay, what about 1 and 4? Those don't exist. Play Homecoming instead.
Yeah, don't. Someone tells you to do that, don't.
That reminds me, Konami did try to make a couple more Silent Hill games by outsourcing them, just like Capcom and whatever did. They made Homecoming, they made Origins, and then they made Shattered Memories. The only good one is Shattered Memories because it's a remake of 1.
It's arguable, too, because even though it's a remake of 1, it tried to do some new things, and some people like it and some don't. My friend, Other Mike, for example, does not like it because of the lack of weapons, basically. They tried to make it more survival horror, which, even just like in the PT demo that was on PS4, some people really liked it. I still have to play it. Some people really liked it, though. The point is, though, nonetheless...
I have it on my console.
Nonetheless, though, it's very hard to play a lot of the back catalog for Silent Hill, and the later titles, they weren't treated very well. Like I said, these companies outsource them, and your best bet for playing the older titles that are not of the 16-bit or 32-bit generation, a lot of them are just really bad ports. Metal Gear, you're a little bit better off. There are some ports to the PS3 or the PSN store, I think, still has downloads for them. So you're a little bit better because Metal Gear sold better, but Silent Hill is supposed to be the answer to Resident Evil, and that series just, a lot of it might just be lost to time at this point.
Yeah, it's sad.
Yeah, that does suck. And then in terms of their other titles, there's a ton of remasters and stuff you can get on your phone and everything that don't play well.
And then they don't make a lot of new console games anymore, honestly. They make, like, Winning 11, which is not for us, of course. It's for people who don't play FIFA for some reason. Weird people. And then you have the unbelievably surprisingly good Super Bomberman R. Like, where did this come from?
I need to play that if it's so good.
Super Bomberman R is this, like, it came out for the Switch at launch. People thought it was okay, but then... People thought it was going to be just come out and not be patched and just be a hunk of garbage, but then they kept patching it and improving things. They added a lot of guest characters that were from Konami's past. They added Vic Viper as a Bomberman character. Yes. They added Mimi and Yami from the Poppin' Music series. Yeah. They added all sorts of interesting characters that you wouldn't expect. And it's actually a very well put together game. They put it on other things than the Switch too. I'm like, who came up with this? Who
at Konami was still actually using their brain? At this point,
like, I would love it if Konami had whoever greenlit this. They need to go and make more new, interesting stuff. I realize that a lot of people who made these classic games aren't working there anymore, but I think whoever came up with this game should be given some sort of leadership position.
Yeah, even like Symphony of the Night's lead director is no longer with Konami either. He's now spearheading his own game,
Bloodstained,
which basically is a successor to Symphony and looks pretty good. And they already released a retro-style version of Castlevania with it. That
Bloodstained.
Yeah, it was Bloodstained. It was a Curse of the Moon.
Yes.
Which was definitely a reference to Castlevania, and the game is great.
Yes.
Yeah, and it was just a teaser for the real one, too, which is actually really cool. I want to see more companies do stuff like that. Like, if you get, like an old retro version of a game coming out to hype you up for the big one, that's a really cool idea. That's another way of, even though he doesn't have access to the Castlevania license, he knows exactly what makes a Metroidvania fun.
The last company we're going to cover is probably one of the worst companies in terms of both porting their old games, of which they have an amazing back catalog, unfortunately, and making new games in the spirit of the originals. And that company is Square Enix.
Mm-hmm.
So Square Enix, very famously the developer of the Final Fantasy series, has developed a certain reputation for taking a very, very long time to release new games.
Yes, not unlike Blizzard. The difference is usually when Blizzard releases that game, it's to wide praise, whereas Square is like,
So
at this point.
So when Final Fantasy was first coming out, the games more or less came out every year.
Yeah, when the Final Fantasy series was successful, anyway.
Every 1 to 2 years, we got a completely different game with a new world, new mechanics, and it was genuinely an event.
Also, it usually built upon the mechanics that the predecessors set forth, like the turn-based style fighting and everything, the battle system, with some nods to the series. One that carries over between all the Final Fantasies, even though the stories themselves are not connected, with the numbered titles anyway. You will still see things like Chocobos and Moogles and the summons like Bahamut will carry over through it. This was Square acknowledging their history and keeping some things consistent, something Nintendo does fantastically, that they're starting to really not do right at all. Because I think during that time, the PlayStation 1, early PS2, they got it. They knew what they were doing. They were producing new titles that were the next evolution, the next step in the Final Fantasy line or the Dragon Quest line. They really are only good at making RPGs, if I have to be honest.
What ends up happening with Square Enix is after the PlayStation 2 versions of their games came out, after Final Fantasy X came out, you could sort of see the cracks appearing, because they made 10-2, which is the first time a numbered game got a sequel within its own setting. And then we got 12, which was really good, but then that took a couple of years to come out, and then 13 after a couple of years came out.
What the developer said about Lightning was she was basically supposed to be 13's female Cloud, which from a design perspective, I think she looks cool. So yeah, I totally agree. I was on board with the character's flat as a board.
When she starts saying things and it's like...
It's almost like she's like more like...
she's very angry.
Yeah, she's always very angry. I almost just want her to sound like the Batman from Dark Knight. Where's the falsity? I could seriously see her doing that, but no.
Cloud had like a reason to be like that in the beginning.
Cloud's head was messed up from the live stream, as well as fusing with Zack's consciousness and memories.
I mean, to an extent, if you know anything about, like, Lightning's not her real name, and she took on that name because she wanted to go protect her sister, blah, 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 but that doesn't really justify it.
No, we're not here to go deep into 13's story. This is what made 13 show that Square was starting to lose it.
It was a rehash.
It was a rehash.
It was a very flashy rehash.
And it also, not only did it rehash older stories, it wasn't as well told, wasn't as well received, and even if that was the case, the combat, the battle system basically played itself. You only got to control one character, the rest of them were all kind of like AI. It was not, a lot of it was very, it sold great because of course Final Fantasy's name was attached to it, so they made Final Fantasy 13-2, because 10-2 did so well, which it honestly didn't really. It did okay. But it made 13-2, which was just two characters, so now it doesn't even really play like Final Fantasy. And then they made Lightning Returns, which was a really bad Devil May Cry action ripoff thing with a Majora's Mask time mechanic. I don't know what they were thinking, but to put where Square themselves were definitely losing their way, literally, they made her tits bigger, and they threw in a ton of fan service costumes.
So cheap, so tasteless.
Yeah, and I mean, don't get me wrong, Lightning's hot. As a straight male, I totally do not have an issue with what her character, but you know what?
I'm more of a Snow Villers guy, if you know what I mean.
Substance matters more, especially when your genre, your series was built on character development, on specific styles of gameplay, on specific styles of story. There's nothing wrong with innovating and adding new things, which you did great over the years, from Final Fantasy 1 to 10. I have friends that do like Final Fantasy 15. I'm very much mixed on it still. But at the same time, they are even willing to admit, you know, it's not the same. It's definitely not. They enjoyed it, but it's a complete departure from the combat, which is not like Kingdom Hearts 2, not like original Final Fantasy, not like Crisis Core, not like anything really. That's, you know, really reminiscent of their back catalog. And on top of that, the game itself was infamously supposed to be Final Fantasy Versus 13.
It was going to be a spin-off. They love their spin-offs.
It wasn't going to be even a spin-off. It was going to follow with the same world, essentially, as the Fabula Crystallinova. I think that's how you say it.
Fabula Nova Crystallis.
Fabula Nova Crystallis
the
series.
mythology of the 13 universe.
Yes. It was going to continue with that, but with totally different characters. Spearheaded as director with Tetsuya Nomura.
Famous for Final Fantasy VII's character designs in the Kingdom Hearts series in particular.
Yes, Square's two best-selling series throughout the entire world, because Dragon Quest still honestly only sells the best in the East. I mean, it has fans here, but it doesn't bring in the numbers.
An example
like
of a series that is very nostalgia-focused to maybe a servile degree, because it's very, very old school even today.
Yes. Yeah, especially it still uses Akira's art direction.
Square Enix takes so long to make most of their games that what they end up doing is getting a lot of their B teams to make mobile games that remind you of when they actually made a video game. So here's a list of some of the titles they've released. At least they're available here. There are many that have been decommissioned, available on old cell phones and stuff. So you have Final Fantasy Dimensions, Final Fantasy Dimensions 2, Final Fantasy All the Bravest, Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, the King's Knight spin-off that was tied to Final Fantasy 15, and Dissidia NT, Dissidia Opera Omnia. All of this garbage is not a mainline game.
Oh, wait. Stop there tell them why it's garbage.
They're garbage because they're entirely derivative of your feelings and don't necessarily stand on their own as games.
Translation: they're all microtransaction, cash-grabbing mobile games that have absolutely no charm, no thought behind them, no engaging gameplay, but take all the characters from your past generation Final Fantasy games you're nostalgia for and expect you to pay for it.
Yes, or they pretend that they're free in the case of Dimensions, and then they are like, oh, you can summon in Cloud, but only if you get them by rolling a die, and if it says Cloud on it, then you get Cloud.
It's like where Nintendo respects the nostalgia and uses it to build their brand. Square just thinks that nostalgia is going to propel them forward and they don't have to try, is the best way I could sum it up.
Definitely. I mean, Dissidia Opera Omnia, that's the mobile game that has sort of a turn-based turn-based combat system. It's sort of like the old school Final Fantasies, but isn't necessarily the same at all, because the story doesn't matter, and all the battles are the same. You can click the auto button and the game plays itself, and you don't have to do anything but make sure that your equipment is leveled. It's just a Skinner box. It has no real substance to it. It's not a real Final Fantasy game. Why is this on my phone? Why does this make me happy? I don't care that Cloud's in my party, and so is Ishtola, whoever the fuck that is from Final Fantasy 11.
The truth of the matter is...
Why is she here? Why are any of these people here? Why should I care? Why am I doing this to myself? Where's the real game?
Gone, because quite frankly, probably the only people that are actually playing these things never probably played the original Final Fantasies in the first place.
I played Opera Omnia for a few days, and I felt like I was going to become a whale, because it felt like I was doing something even though I wasn't. After a certain point, I was like, I gotta level up my stupid sword, so I'll put it on Cloud, I'll press the auto button on the stupid high-level battles, and hopefully I will survive. And I was like, I'm not doing anything. I'm getting into a loop.
We already did games as a service, and that's basically what this is. All these mobile games with the Final Fantasy characters just kind of jammed in there. You could literally reskin these as any characters. I could literally take the same game. Oh, wait a minute. Square did exactly that with the Final Fantasy 15 mobile game.
Square, you know all those city builder games for the mobile games? You can download Come Play This, My Lord? They did that with Final Fantasy 15.
They literally just took the game and reskinned it to be Final Fantasy, with like terrible little cutscenes of Noctis from 15 talking to you. To those of you that enjoyed 15, I'm not saying the game itself is an absolute disaster. It's not. There are enjoyable elements to it. It's probably a matter of opinion. I can't meet a soul that defends this. I don't know anybody that defends this.
Well, this is sort of another little side topic, but what Square likes to do ever since Final Fantasy 13-2 is they like to have a little cute little cameos from other developers from games that people care about. Final Fantasy 13-2 infamously had a Mass Effect 2 collaboration where you could download armor for your main two characters that resembled the N7 armor. And then they had the whole Assassin's Creed Origins DLC for Final Fantasy 15 that was a timed event that had a whole separate little campaign all sort of tied into like the lore of the Assassins that somehow the 4 dudes of 15 were involved with for whatever reason. It's like they clearly know that Western gamers don't care, but they're trying to like shake this thing in front of being like, you know this game that you like? Well, you can do this in our game, which you should be buying today.
They should hire you. That's basically what they're doing.
It's just so desperate in a way that's even less genuine than... Okay, the nostalgia thing is at least admitting they used to make something good, but in this other case, it's like they're clearly just trying to make a business deal to shake a carrot in front of someone's face. Hey, you know that thing that you like? Well, it's in this thing that you might like. Please like it.
And you know what I think is even worse?
It's parasitic. It's going off of the value of another IP. It's not ensuring that your IP is in any way valuable and resonating across different generations. It's insulting to people. It's like going in to watch another superhero movie. Let's imagine you're going to see the next Spider-Man movie and they start to play 10 minutes of Avengers Endgame in there just to remind you that it's a better movie than this other one is. It'd be like if they do that.
I mean, that's arguable. Some people prefer the mainline Marvel stories over the Avenger compilations.
Imagine you're seeing Deadpool 3, and then in the middle of the movie, Deadpool goes, this is boring. Let's watch 10 minutes of Bumblebee 2 in theaters next month. That's what the equivalent of it is. It's just so insulting.
That's better. That's a lot better, actually.
So, in short, Square is the most disingenuous company in terms of their nostalgia cash-ins because they don't really know what they're doing anymore, and I really seriously... Okay, the biggest albatross around their neck right now is the Final Fantasy VII Remake.
Yep. I agree. I think a lot of it has to do with... it always goes back to the top. A lot of it's mismanagement, and I think that's where a lot of these bad decisions are really coming from, is the top management. I really don't think... from a director standpoint, Square has any idea what they're doing anymore. They are literally just analyzing charts and the market and being like, well, people like this, so take it and throw one of our IPs on it. That is what they made a rhythm game, which has its fans, but again...
Theater Rhythm is okay, but it's also very unoriginal and kind of boring.
Yes. I mean, like I said, if you like Theater Rhythm, good for you. The point is, I could remove Final Fantasy from it, and it would make absolutely no difference to the
They tried making a Dragon Quest one, but it was not good. Didn't even come out in the West.
Yeah, the West barely even gets any Dragon Quest game, which is sad because it seems that's the only place quality seems to be going into a lot of RPGs with Square anymore.
Arguably, Dragon Quest is a whole other topic entirely. I can't really speak in any of theory.
We need Jay for that.
Definitely.
Jay understands Dragon Quest.
He's literally the slime.
He is a slime, as you've seen.
So, in short, Square Enix is more or less the bottom of the bottom in terms of companies that pretend that they respect their fans and they love their heritage, but they don't.
I want to say one more thing to really sum it up. And this is similar to the stuff going on, I think, with Konami, with Kojima, and exiting them and starting their own thing. So as I stated earlier, Final Fantasy Versus 13 is what 15 was originally going to be, which had a totally different story, totally different setting. And all of that was scrapped except for just the 4 main characters, which were still kind of rewritten, and Noctis's love interest was totally changed. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because the director of that was forced to work on Kingdom Hearts 3, which went through 2 different engines until it finally went to Unreal and was the definitive one what Kingdom Hearts 3 came out on. And I have to say, as a Kingdom Hearts fan that played all their spin-offs for the most part and stuff, I feel like Kingdom Hearts 3, regardless of, I'm not going to talk about the story or anything, I don't want to ruin that for anybody. I feel like a lot of decisions for that game came from the top because, again, this is where Square doesn't understand their audience. There's almost no reference to Final Fantasy in Kingdom Hearts. They're practically
Kingdom Hearts 3.
In Kingdom Hearts 3, anyway, I should say. My bad. In Kingdom Hearts 3, there's almost absolutely no reference to Final Fantasy characters, which was part of the selling point of the original Kingdom Hearts to begin with. And as you go down the years, you notice they start to kind of fizzle them out until 3 literally just, I believe all it has is just their mentions of Cloud and Auron at the Hercules Coliseum. That's it. That's all you get. That whole, everything with Radiant Guard, gone.
You know what you get instead? Frozen.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong.
They doubled down on all the Disney and Pixar stuff.
Yeah, not only did they took a lot of the charm of the Renaissance Disney era out. So I get they already did it, but they're really pushing towards just the 3D Pixar Disney movies, which is all that's in the game. I'm not going to talk about story and the Heartless and the Organization 13. I don't want to ruin that on anybody, but they also made a ton of decisions that just reek of corporate looking at charts and statistics, like, we're going to do this. So they got only the 3D Disney movies. Sora has a smartphone now. with an Instagram clone that uses hearts instead of hashtags. And,
Japan does love social media a lot, so I think it's kind of cute.
It's cute, but at the same time, does this sound like somebody that actually was heading the development of the game, most likely really wanted in the game? Be honest with yourself.
Honestly, I don't think that's like a corporate, we have to include modern things sort of thing. I think it's more or less just a cute thing that the designers put in there, because it just, Kingdom Hearts has always been at its best when it's not super duper anime grimdark serious. When it is aware of how silly it is and has fun with itself.
Yeah, I mean, the story's insane. I'm not going to touch the story, but, well, my personal opinion, I think these things do. But even if regardless, you can disagree on that, you can't disagree on this. This is a bit of a spoiler for the game, so skip this if you want to, but it's not that big a deal.
I haven't played it either, you know?
This is not a big deal, I promise you. You know about it.
Okay.
Very early in the game, one of the first worlds, I won't say which one at least, you will see a fake trailer to a video game that exists in their world that I believe is called Verum Rex, that uses...
Verum Rex,
that's it. That uses models very similar looking to Final Fantasy Versus 13. And then throughout that world, you will see this plastered all over that world. I don't know, that to me, that's a developer screaming right now the fact they were taken off of their project and forced to do this. That should tell you right there that something's very, very wrong at Square Enix right now. And on top of that, all the drama stories with these companies starting to leak out now, all the mishandling of their employees, the artists, developers, musicians even. Not looking good. So,
in short, that's kind of what we have for the present. I think Square Enix is the lowest point. Nintendo has always been the highest point. And in between, you have some little success stories like SNK. And hopefully, some of the smaller developers and publishers that haven't been absorbed by mega corporations, rest in peace Hudson, can go and follow the model that SNK has built for them. So what's the future then?
You know, there's not too much we can say about the future compared to the present, but there is definitely a few things we can touch on.
Where are you going to play these games in the future? You're going to play them on your consoles or PS? A lot of people think consoles are going to go away. The next generation of consoles is going to be the last consoles ever.
Okay, no. we really do not know that entirely. But one thing I could say for sure with the future is there's definitely going to be more options to play old school games as well as even retro games on more platforms. Mobile is probably going to be the biggest one.
You know what company is doing a big mobile push? Sega. Sega has the Sega Forever line of, you can go and have Genesis games on your phone. You can play them for free with ads, or you can pay a couple bucks and you can play them without ads. And they have a huge selection of their Genesis games already available on Google Play as well as iTunes.
Yes. And even removing from those services, which are still very much based on the you download the game and then you have it to play it on that device.
Very game by game.
Yes. Now, moving forward to the way all other forms of media are consumed today via streaming, you have music, movies, TV, Netflix, Spotify, things like that. I think we're going to start seeing games done this way too, as it's already being put into place by some things like Stadia, which we discussed in our last podcast, linked below, or somewhere. You're going to see more old school games probably. They're going to keep digging up these catalogs. I mean, I'm not going to lie. They're basically dead horses. They're going to be beaten to oblivion because it doesn't cost a lot. And you know what? It's fine because at least people get a chance to experience them, especially kids. I'm happy to see kids at least get to experience this stuff, especially as microtransactions are shoved down their throat. They get to play a complete game. That's nice. At least, if they care. Some do, some don't. It's a generational thing, but I think also it could be just an individual thing too. Regardless, first we just had consoles, and we have PCs kind of integrating with each other. Then we have older games being released on consoles. Now we're at the point where TVs are literally smart devices. Your TV is a computer. You're fairly certain in 20 more years, your toaster oven and your regular oven and your microwave are all going to have a touchscreen on them. I guarantee it.
Your walls are going to be a touchscreen.
I can't wait. God, dude, if your walls...
Get a 4K meme, stretch it out to the size of the wall.
Dude,
I wake up and it's like,
Dude, that would be great. My God, remember changing each other's backgrounds on the computer to like random crap to mess with people?
Change their literal wallpaper.
Change the wallpaper, just a bunch of dicks. Just wake up surrounded by dicks. Like, oh, that's great. This is a very mature podcast.
I guess I am surrounded by dicks.
Well, you're surrounded by dicks. I'm usually not. Most of the time. But,
nice one.
But basically, yeah, as technology gets better, it's going to be offered on more platforms. I think streaming services like your TV, Roku, things like that, you're going to see them more, especially because as more storage becomes available, these games are tiny. A lot of them are just a few megabytes. You can stick them on anything these days. Years ago, storage was such a premium. Now it's like, oh, 1 terabyte SD card? Yeah, $80.
And now we have the debut of 5G connections. You soon might be able to go and stream a 1 gigabyte game to your phone.
Yeah, as internet speeds get better. So, at least that's a bright part of the future, is the fact that as technology improves, accessibility should improve.
And now we have people who appreciate the retro games now who are going to become developers and get into the industry. They have an appreciation for this sort of thing. And then they're going to be able to go and say, we want this game available that I loved back when I was a kid for everyone else. And now I have this way to go and like make these deals and make it happen.
Yeah, which is fantastic. And hopefully that will push us further away from the cash grab mentality of the app games, Sega stuff, the plug-and-play consoles that are of lesser quality, and Sony being really, cheap with the PlayStation Classic. I would not be surprised. PS2 is hard to emulate, but I noticed that they tried again with something and put way more effort after seeing what a failure this was, because it could have worked. It could have been so good.
Definitely. So official emulation will improve as consumers become a little more discerning.
Yes, definitely, because even as the casual market begins to fade out and you're only appealing to that hardcore market again, you don't have a choice. Official emulation will improve because there's more interest now, whereas before it was kind of just let's just do this and make a quick buck. Now it's like, no, there's a real audience for this. We can put all that little nice touches out. The Mega Man Legacy Collection has all the art history, the concept art in it, all the names of the enemies and stuff. Little touches like this that really the collectors love. Collectors love anything that tells them more about the games that they're into. And that's a collector for anything. Just like a hardcore audiophile for bands will buy the DVDs of the live performances with all the backstage conversations about them where they did a ton of drugs and stuff and had the best tour ever. That's the same thing here. If we get more products like that, I'd even be willing to buy them when I already own a ton of original cartridges. Just because I appreciate that. And that's really cool to get that stuff.
Because I don't have to buy them myself because he has them.
Oh, please. I'm probably borrowing more of your library still off Steam. Not to mention, you're the PS2 king, honestly.
Definitely.
I have more of the cartridges.
I am definitely a PS2 connoisseur, and I believe that when that becomes retro, I'm going to go and do my own content there.
That should be interesting. I'm excited for that. But now, as we've said, great things in the future, bad things too. Always, of course, dealing with the business side of stuff. Not everything can be remade, re-released, or even accessed.
I mean, backwards compatibility will get better because consoles have become a lot more like computers. You don't have to make separate versions of games like you used to have to in the past due to different architecture and bespoke hardware. So you'll be able to play PS4 on your PS5, Sony said.
Yeah, but licenses, business, copyrights, trademarks.
Will you be able to play Kingdom Hearts in 10 years?
Yeah, you could play Kingdom Hearts, I'm sure. I don't think Square's ever going to drop that license. And I mean, if Square goes out, they'll sell it to somebody that probably will still make money off it. But some games, though, are never going to be released again. Either because the license is too difficult to get a hold of, especially a lot of retro games, or there's not much of a market for it. The company that has the license doesn't want to do anything with it. And there's really not much we can do about it, honestly. Especially stuff like any of the core titles developed... Not the core titles, but the licensed titles developed by Konami or Capcom in the NES days.
DuckTales Collection was a big fluke.
It was.
The Disney Afternoon Collection, rather.
Yeah, you think we're ever going to see the Noah's Ark game by Konami ever again?
Super Noah's Ark 3, that was a...
Not Super Noah's Ark 3, there's a different one.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's really bizarre and weird. He can, like, turn into stuff. I'll show little bits of it in the video, but it's actually a decent game. But, you know, it was made by Konami.
Sometimes you have really weird instances where, like, a company will, like, remember they have the rights to something, and then the original designers are still around. Like, you know Mr. Gimmick?
Mm-hmm.
The NES, they're making an arcade version of that.
That's cool.
With, like, the original composers rearranging the music, it's, like, got, like, nicer redrawn graphics. So it's, like, random, well-beloved NES obscure platformer, great music coming out again.
So tell me, though, are we ever going to see anything like Holy Diver ever again?
No.
Yeah.
Because that game, for those the uninitiated, is a horror-style Castlevania-esque game with covers of heavy metal music in it.
It's another problem, too. Even, you know...
Japan's a lot looser with this sort of thing. It's a Japan-only game.
It is. But even with that, though, I don't think even Japan's going to see it again. All we really have to go off of are, like, either piracy on the internet, downloading it, or reproductions, which are a legal gray area, too. And are really just still the NES game, but, like, not everybody wants to buy an expensive, limited-run reproduction that I think is over $100 still.
Yeah.
Which it is. It does have a license from the company that owns the game, but they're not throwing it on Virtual Console. You can't get it on a classic. You could hack it and throw it on there, but you're never going to see like anything like that again, probably. You're never going to see a lot of the NES era titles are probably never coming back. And things further behind that, like Atari stuff too, or even earlier than that, are just going to be lost to time. Just like sad. We're never getting movies. What was it? Before 1940, we lost over half of the movies made because they weren't archived. Yeah. We still don't have all of Metropolis. We'll never have all of it. Unless someone ever discovers it, it's gone. We only have what we could recover. And games are kind of going to go that way. And if, in terms of the scariness of this fact, in terms of power taken away from the consumers to archive games, again, watch the last podcast because we cover that really well.
And then you might have instances where, okay, there's only 2 or 3 of these games left in existence, and then the collectors want to maintain the value of their games, so they're not going to dump the ROM. So there was a pretty famous case of an Atari game that was never released in the early 80s called AKR. There was only 3 cabinets left in existence, and you can only play them at events because the collectors were hoarding them, and someone mysteriously dumps the ROM. It was a big hullabaloo all about, who stole this? This devalues our cabinets. The whole preservation scene is chock full of examples of people who go and get a prototype for a game that's strange, and then they hoard it and they ask for thousands of dollars to dump the ROM so they can recoup their investment. It's total greed.
It is. And
there was a game called Socks the Cat Rocks the Hill, based on Bill Clinton's cat, Socks the Cat. And the guy who owned that game barely gave anyone a footage of it. He just hoarded it and he teased people with it. People were so angry at him because all he would do was troll people for years. Then he's like, oh, I'm going to do a limited release for $70 a pop. I'm going to make repro cartridges. I'm going to finally give it to you people. You have to pay me money. Isn't that so cynical?
It's very cynical. Also, I mean, even if he throws out a repro cartridge, can't someone buy it, throw it on the internet, and be like, see ya?
Yeah, but you have to understand that there's a certain market for people who want to go and like own it themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Like there was a Virtual Boy game called Bound High that was never officially released, but there's a full English prototype out there that they ended up releasing for $75.
I don't have an issue with the collector wanting to hang on to the original, I suppose, or even sell it to a museum for good costs, but I do think it's fair that they at least release the ROM. It's not going to devalue the original, because that's a one-of-a-kind item. You can throw any ROM on a reproduction cartridge, and this is something I want to state, too, in terms of game preservation moving forward. I think this practice is going to go up for the next 10 years, and then it's going to drop like a rock. Because at this point, I don't think people are going to be buying cartridges by 2030 anymore. I think it's going to come to an end at that point.
Because they won't read.
They won't read. You'd be surprised. These things can last for a good while. But
it reminds me of the Saturn market. Like, disc rot is a big
disc rot is going to hit harder than cartridges. Cartridges are built to last way longer.
I keep my PS2 stuff in good condition in a nice dry place.
Yes. Yeah, most of my PS2 stuff plays great, too. Ironically enough, I've killed 360 games faster than PS2 games.
Well, I keep them in their case. I dump them to a hard drive and play it off of the hard drive.
Yep. Yeah, lots of awesome options. But what I'm saying is, though, in terms of accessibility of old school games moving forward and nostalgia, a lot of people, non-official companies, are making money off reproduction cartridges and other offerings that are a legal gray area, to be perfectly honest with you.
Homebrew, too.
Homebrew's legal.
Yeah.
And that's actually a good thing. By all means, homebrew's awesome, but that's also going to die down eventually.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just natural. And I don't think anybody is ever going to be really like, I want to make homebrew for the PS3? It's kind of weird.
I make emulators.
There's going to be an emulator on everything. Some guy is always like, I found this ancient alien technology that could do, bam, I got Doom running on this. That guy is always going to exist.
Well, like, the people who port RetroArch to everything, we forgot to mention RetroArch completely, but, you know.
Well, I mean, it's not really nostalgia. RetroArch is more emulation.
It's a packaging of a thing. You don't have
we need to do a whole thing on emulation to do RetroArch. That's another topic.
Yes.
But emulation is just important for nostalgia, and reproductions are important for nostalgia because that's what they're capitalizing now. Moving forward, when that nostalgia baiting starts to fade, it's just going to go back to hardcore enthusiasts again. And it's not going to be focused so much on nostalgia, but people that just prefer to just play this until they're dead, basically.
Yes.
Which is true. Some people want to watch old Western movies until they're dead. My grandfather loves doing that. So, hey, makes you happy? Cool. But it's not going to last forever.
Right.
And I think eventually digital is going to be the only way to preserve this stuff. So by all means, if you have something that wasn't released, I don't care if you keep the original or sell it big to a museum, at least dump the game.
Go on Assembler Games, see if people know what it is. Talk to the cutting room floor people. Get it out there somehow. Go to the VR board on 4chan. They got some cool people there.
Yeah. I mean, I'll put links down below, too, for some, for some game preservation websites to access, because it's still art. It's still history.
Don't do the StarCraft Gold Disc thing.
No, please don't do that.
For the uninitiated, game called StarCraft, you might have heard of it. Biggest RTS ever made. Someone found the source code of it randomly in a bunch of CDs they got from someone who used to work at Blizzard rather. And then instead of dumping it and allowing people to go and make their own versions of StarCraft, he just gave it to Blizzard, Activision Blizzard, and it's like, thanks. Here's some Overwatch stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. I guess that's up to personal opinion. It is theirs after all, but I don't think Blizzard, companies protecting their source code, we talked about that with games as a service and stuff. Blizzard, at least, you can play any Blizzard game you want. They were always a PC focused. I don't think that's ever going to be an issue.
Yeah.
I think how good their games are going to be going forward is going to be an issue. But as far as playing their back catalog, take your pick. It's no problem. It's consoles that are in... The consoles and, DOS games and stuff, they're probably in a bigger trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, and arcade games especially. Arcade games are probably in the worst spot.
With that concludes our longest recording ever.
Yeah, this one got way further than I expected, but it was
we had
fun.
a lot to talk about.
Yeah, we did. And now we want to hear about you. What did you think of all this? Do you think there are other companies that we missed potentially that are handling nostalgia better? How do you feel about gamers being targeted with nostalgia like this currently? I mean, just say the word Pokemon and 90s kids go, oh my god, Pokemon!
Gen 1, Gen 1, Gen 1.
I still love Gen 1, but I can still see the difference, though. The point is, how do you feel about all this going on? Do you think companies are respecting gamers? Do you think they're insulting them? Do you feel some companies are doing better there? Do you agree with us? Disagree with us? Tell us. Let us know in the comments. Try to reply as much as I can. Thank you again for watching the Pixel Vision podcast. I'm Gamer Rez.
I'm Deft Beck.
And we'll catch you next time.
See you later.